I had been living in my apartment for just over a month when I started to notice something strange. It was an older building, nothing fancy but perfectly fine for someone like me who preferred quiet over luxury. My apartment was on the third floor, tucked away in a corner unit with a beautiful view of the small park across the street. For the first few weeks, everything was normal. But then, things started to shift. It started small. I'd hear knocks on my door at odd hours, always in the middle of the night, sometimes right around 2 a.m., sometimes later. I'd rush to the door, but when I opened it, there was no one there. At first, I chalked it up to some late-night prankster or maybe an issue with the building's old plumbing or wiring. Maybe someone was knocking on the wrong door. But then it happened again. And again. Same time, same silence after I opened the door. I decided to leave a note on the door. If you're knocking, please let me know who you are. That night, I waited, heart pounding, but no one came. I tried to go to sleep, but just as I was about to drift off, there it was again. 3 sharp knocks at my door, followed by the same eerie silence. I threw the blanket off and rushed out, but once again the hallway was empty. No sign of anyone, no other doors opening or closing. Just the strange quiet of the building. The knocking continued every few nights, always at the same time, but no one ever showed up when I opened the door. By this point, I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. Was I sleepwalking? Hearing things? But then, something happened that changed everything. One evening, I was coming back from the store, arms full of groceries. As I reached the top of the stairs, I saw a shadowy figure standing in front of my door. It was tall, slender, and I could only make out the silhouette of a person but not their face. My heart skipped a beat. I thought it was a neighbor, so I greeted them, but the figure didn't respond. They just stood there motionless. "Excuse me?" I said, trying to get their attention. Still nothing. I felt a strange chill run down my spine as I carefully approached them. "Are you okay?" I asked, feeling foolish, but my words felt hollow. It was like the figure wasn't even hearing me. I took another step closer, and in a split second, they disappeared into thin air. Just vanished. I stood there frozen, my groceries dropping to the floor in disbelief. I couldn't explain it. How could someone just disappear like that? Was I imagining it? Was it a trick of the light, a shadow from the flickering hallway light? I rushed inside my apartment, locked the door, and sat on the couch, heart racing. I tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was a neighbor, maybe someone from down the hall, but the way the figure disappeared, it wasn't normal. I had to know who it was and what they wanted. So, I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I started snooping around the building. I began asking the other tenants if they had ever experienced anything strange. Most of them said no, but there was one woman on the second floor who seemed unnervingly familiar with the story. "Oh, you're having the knocking problem?" she said, her face drawn with a strange seriousness. "I had that too. And I've seen them too, the person who walks up and down the halls late at night. They never speak, never respond, but they're always there." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I pressed her for more details, but she just shook her head, like she didn't want to talk about it. "Don't go looking for them," she warned me, her voice low and trembling. "Trust me, you don't want to know." I couldn't shake her words, but I needed to know more. I continued to ask around, and eventually, a tenant who had lived in the building for over 10 years shared something that chilled me to my core. "Don't you know?" he asked, looking over his shoulder like he was worried someone might overhear. "There used to be someone living in your apartment. The one before you. He just disappeared. No one ever heard from him again. They say he had been hearing knocking on his door for weeks. He started to lose his mind. No one ever saw him leave, but the landlord found all his things still inside. His clothes, his furniture, everything. But he was gone. No trace. Just nothing. I felt like the air was sucked from my lungs. The missing tenant. The knocking. The shadowy figure. Was it possible that the person who lived here before me had somehow never left? That whatever had driven him away had also followed me? I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, I sat awake in my apartment, staring at the door, waiting for the knocks. At exactly 2:13 a.m. it came. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks. My heart raced as I hesitated, my hand resting on the doorknob. I had to know if it was real. I had to know if the figure would appear again. I opened the door. Nothing. No one in the hallway. But this time, I noticed something else. The air felt heavier, almost like the walls were pressing in on me. There, on the floor right in front of the door, was a small object. It was a photo, a faded, old picture of a man in a suit. He was standing outside this very building, smiling, but there was something unsettling about his eyes. They were hollow, empty. The back of the photo was scratched with black marks, as though someone had tried to erase something. I picked it up, feeling my pulse thumping in my ears. There was no name, no date, just the man in the photo standing in front of this building just like I had been. But what was worse was the message scrawled in faded ink on the back. "You are not alone." I dropped the photo in horror, my mind spinning. My blood ran cold. Was it the previous tenant who left this? Was it somehow a warning? I couldn't stay another night. I packed up everything I could, not bothering to tell anyone, and left in the middle of the night. I never went back to that apartment. But every now and then I'll hear a faint knocking sound when I'm at home, like a distant memory, a reminder of something I tried to forget. I never found out who or what was knocking on my door. But sometimes when I'm in a quiet building, I'll hear those same 3 knocks. And I'll know deep down that whatever haunted that apartment is still out there watching, waiting for the next person to move in. I had just moved to a new apartment, eager for a fresh start. The building was old but charming, and my new place was on the 3rd floor with a decent view of the street. I didn't expect much from my new neighbors, just the usual mix of quiet residents who kept to themselves. I had been living in the city for a while, and I was used to the hum of traffic and the occasional siren in the distance. But something about this apartment felt different from the start. It was on the corner of a quiet street, far enough from the city center that there weren't many pedestrians, but close enough that I could still see the occasional car drive by. The apartment itself was a bit run down, cracked plaster on the walls, a few squeaky floorboards, and a window that refused to stay fully shut. But despite these quirks, it felt like home. The first week passed without incident. I spent my evenings settling in, arranging furniture, and catching up on my favorite shows. But about a week after I moved in, I started to notice something strange. It was subtle at first, easy to ignore. As I sat on the couch, I would occasionally catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, through the window. At first, I thought it was just a neighbor or someone walking by, but after a few more occurrences, I began to realize something was off. Each time I saw movement, it was always the same. A shadowy figure standing still, just beyond the edge of my vision, just outside the window. Every time I looked, they were gone. I convinced myself it was just the way the light hit the street or a trick of my tired eyes. But the feeling of being watched started to gnaw at me. I would pull the curtains back, check, and find nothing. But every time I returned to my couch, I felt it, an uncomfortable, prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if someone was standing just beyond the window, peering inside. One evening, I decided to confront it. It was a quiet night, and the street outside was dark except for a few dim street lights. I was watching TV when I saw it again, a figure standing at the corner of the building just past the window. This time I didn't look away. I stared. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing. I couldn't make out any details, but I could see the faint outline of a face, just barely visible in the dim light. The figure stood perfectly still, not moving, just staring at the window. My heart skipped a beat and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I quickly got up and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back with a shaking hand. But when I looked, there was no one there. The street was empty, the corner dark and silent. The figure had vanished. Shaking, I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling didn't go away. That night, I locked all the windows and turned off the lights, hoping that if there was anyone out there, they would go away. But the next night, the same thing happened. The figure appeared again, always in the same place, always at the same time. I would see it standing outside my window, just out of reach, staring at me. And every time I went to the window, it was gone. I couldn't understand what was going on. Why hadn't I noticed this person before? Was I just being paranoid? But then the tapping started. It was faint at first, barely audible. A soft, rhythmic tapping on the glass. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was coming from the window. I didn't move. The tapping continued, gentle at first, then louder and more urgent. I slowly stood up and moved toward the window, my body trembling. When I reached the curtain, I hesitated for a moment, but then pulled it back. There was nothing there. The street was empty. But the tapping didn't stop. It was coming from the inside of the apartment. I spun around, my eyes darting from corner to corner. Nothing. The tapping grew louder, now from behind me, echoing through the empty room. I whipped around in panic, but there was still no one there. I slammed the window shut, the sound of the glass echoing through the quiet apartment. I checked every door and window, double-locked them, and pulled the curtains tightly shut. I wasn't going to let whatever this was get to me. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the dark, too afraid to turn the lights on, too afraid to move. The next day, I called the landlord and asked about the apartment. I told him everything, the figure, the tapping, the strange feeling of being watched. He was quiet for a moment, then told me in an almost regretful tone that I wasn't the first one to have strange experiences in that apartment. He explained that the building was old and the previous tenant had moved out suddenly, but no one had been able to explain why. He suggested I might be hearing things or seeing shadows from the street, but something in his voice told me he knew more than he was letting on. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing faint scratching sounds coming from the walls, like something was moving behind the plaster. The sound of tapping started again, but this time it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from inside the apartment, right next to my bed. I grabbed my phone and checked the time, 3:15 a.m. The tapping continued, rhythmic and slow, but it wasn't coming from anywhere I could see. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things and left the apartment, not knowing where to go, just needing to get away. I haven't been back since. I still don't know what happened in that apartment. Was it a shadow or was I really being watched? I'll never know. But one thing I do know is that every time I see a dark figure out of the corner of my eye, I remember the apartment, the tapping, and the feeling that someone, was always just behind the glass, waiting for me to look away. I had just moved into a new apartment in a quiet neighborhood, far from the bustle of the city. It was a charming, older building with hardwood floors, creaky doors, and high ceilings, a place I could see myself calling home. The landlord had warned me that the place was a little quirky, but that didn't deter me. The rent was cheap and the location was perfect. I figured I'd be fine. The apartment was on the second floor, and while I had done a quick walkthrough before signing the lease, I hadn't paid much attention to the basement. The landlord mentioned that it was mostly used for storage and that tenants weren't really supposed to go down there. I thought it was a bit strange, but it didn't seem important at the time. I had a lot on my plate with the move. My first week was uneventful. I spent my evenings unpacking, settling in, and enjoying the quiet. But as the days passed, I started to notice little things. Small creaks in the walls, strange noises at night. It was nothing alarming at first, just the usual sounds of an old building. But then, a few nights in, something started to bother me. Around midnight, I would hear what sounded like footsteps, slow, heavy steps, coming from below. At first, I convinced myself it was just the building settling or maybe some noise from the floor beneath me. But the more I listened, the more certain I became that the steps were deliberate, as though someone, or something, was walking around in the basement. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my imagination or the quirks of an old building, but it kept happening. Every night around the same time. The strange footsteps would start, followed by a faint sound of dragging, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. One night I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and decided to investigate. The thought of checking out the basement hadn't occurred to me until now, but the sounds were starting to get to me. I stood in front of the door that led down to the basement, a metal door with a rusted handle that hadn't been opened since I moved in. I hesitated for a moment. The landlord had specifically told me not to go down there, and part of me wondered if I was breaking some rule. But curiosity got the better of me. I twisted the handle and opened the door. A cold rush of air hit me and the smell of mildew filled my nostrils. The staircase descended into darkness, the steps old and worn. I flicked on my flashlight and started down. The beams of light bounced off the stone walls, casting strange, long shadows across the narrow stairway. It felt like I was walking into another time, like the house itself was holding its breath. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The noises had stopped. There was no more dragging, no more footsteps. The basement was eerily still. It was mostly empty, save for a few old wooden crates, a broken chair, and dusty shelves stacked with boxes. I scanned the room, feeling an odd sense of unease creeping up my spine. The walls were bare, the concrete floor cracked and uneven. But then something caught my eye. At the far end of the basement there was a door. It was small, almost hidden behind a stack of old crates. I hadn't noticed it before, and it seemed out of place, like it didn't belong in this otherwise empty space. The door was made of heavy, dark wood, and its edges were worn and chipped. There was a lock on it, old and rusted, but no key. I couldn't stop myself. I walked toward it, the beam of my flashlight shaking in my hand. The closer I got, the more I felt an odd tension in the air, like something was pulling me toward that door. I reached out and tried the handle. It was locked, but the wood creaked slightly under my touch. I pressed my ear against it, listening for any sounds from the other side. For a moment there was nothing. Then, faintly, I heard something, soft breathing. It was barely audible, but it was there. I stepped back, my heart racing. My mind was spinning with questions, but one thought kept repeating itself. Who or what was on the other side of that door? I turned to leave, but as I walked back toward the stairs, I heard it again. A loud bang like something heavy falling. My flashlight flickered, and I rushed up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though the house itself was trying to keep me down there. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I decided to confront the landlord. I went downstairs to the management office, trying to act casual as I asked about the basement. She looked at me with wide, startled eyes. "What do you mean?" she asked. "There's no basement in this building." I stared at her, confused. The door to the basement. I just came from there. Her face went pale. "That's impossible," she said, her voice shaky. "There's nothing down there but storage. No other rooms. The basement was sealed off years ago." I was certain I wasn't imagining things. There had been a door, a lock, and a room. I could still picture it vividly in my mind. But when I went back down to show her, the door was gone. There was only an empty, crumbling wall where it had been. I didn't stay in that apartment much longer after that. The strange events continued. Footsteps in the halls, doors creaking open by themselves, an overwhelming sense of being watched. But I never went back to that basement, and I never found out what was behind that door. To this day, I can't explain it. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe there was something else, something darker, hiding in that house. But I'll never forget the basement that shouldn't have been there. It was supposed to be a simple drive to my parents' house for Christmas. A 3-hour trip at most. I had already packed up my car the night before, filled with gifts and a bag of homemade cookies my mom had insisted I bring. The roads were clear when I left in the morning, and the weather forecast predicted nothing but light snow. Perfect conditions for a quick drive through the mountains. But as I made my way through the winding roads, the weather quickly began to change. The light snowfall gradually turned into a heavy flurry, and within a matter of minutes, the visibility dropped to nearly zero. I thought about pulling over, but there wasn't anywhere to stop. No gas stations, no houses, just me and a narrow road carved into the mountainside. The wind howled and the snowflakes hit my windshield like tiny sharp needles. I couldn't see the lines on the road anymore. The wipers were useless, just smearing the snow around in streaks. The temperature was dropping fast, and I started to regret not turning back when I had the chance. I drove slower, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, but the road seemed endless. Every time I thought I might be close to a clearing, the snow would intensify, and I would lose all sense of direction. The swirling snow outside was suffocating, like being trapped in a blizzard that had no end. Then it happened. The engine sputtered and coughed before it finally died. I tried to restart it, but the car refused to budge. Panic started to creep in. I couldn't see anything through the windows except the thick, swirling snow. No lights from any nearby towns. No signs of life. Just the eerie sound of the wind roaring past, louder than anything I'd ever heard. I sat there for a few minutes, taking deep breaths, trying to calm myself. I was miles from anywhere and I had no cell service. The radio was silent except for static. The temperature inside the car began to drop rapidly, and I realized how much worse this could get. I checked my phone, but of course there was no signal. The snow was piling up around the car, and I could already see the first signs of the tires being buried. If I stayed in here too long, I wouldn't be able to open the door, and if the storm kept up, I might freeze. My first instinct was to leave the car and try to find shelter. But the thought of getting lost in the storm terrified me. I had no idea how far I was from the nearest town. I could barely see past the hood of the car, and even if I walked in the direction I thought was right, I'd be wandering blindly into the white nothingness. I stayed in the car for what felt like hours, my body stiff with cold. The wind howled outside, and every time I glanced out the window, the snow was coming down even harder, the world outside a complete blur of white. I pulled on my coat and wrapped a scarf around my neck, trying to stay warm. Just when I thought I couldn't take it any longer, I saw a figure through the swirling snow. I froze. There, standing in the middle of the road, was someone. At first, I thought it was a hallucination. The figure was barely visible, just a shadow in the storm. But then it moved. Slowly, deliberately. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a person, dressed in dark clothing. They were walking toward my car, through the deepening snow. My heart began to race. I grabbed my phone again, but still no signal. The figure kept getting closer, and a strange unease washed over me. What was someone doing out here in the middle of nowhere in a storm like this? It didn't make sense. I considered locking the doors, but I wasn't sure if it would make any difference. I couldn't see the person's face. I didn't know if they were trying to help or if they had other intentions. I waited, unable to move. The figure was now only a few feet away from the car. I pressed myself against the seat, holding my breath, praying they wouldn't notice me. And then, just as suddenly as the figure appeared, it was gone. The snow swirled and the shape melted back into the whiteness. I blinked, staring at the spot where they had stood. There was no sign of them now. I couldn't even hear the crunch of footsteps in the snow. It was as though they had never been there at all. I sat there for a long time, staring into the swirling storm, wondering if my mind had simply played tricks on me. Had I imagined the figure? Had I been so desperate for hope that I had conjured up someone to ease my fear? The thought made my skin crawl, but there was no time to dwell on it. I had to act. I started the car again, this time with more force, and after what felt like an eternity, the engine sputtered to life. The dashboard flickered on, and the headlights cut through the snow ahead of me. I couldn't believe it, but the car was running again. I kept driving, slowly at first, but as the road began to wind back downhill, the storm seemed to ease just a little. The visibility improved slightly, and I was able to spot the outline of a small cabin in the distance, nestled in the trees. It looked abandoned, but it was better than staying in the car, frozen and alone. I pulled into the driveway, jumped out, and ran up to the door, praying it was unlocked. To my relief, it was. Inside, the cabin was warm and quiet. I collapsed on the couch, trembling from the cold, my heart still racing. The storm raged on outside, but at least I had shelter. It wasn't until hours later, as I sat by the fire, that I finally felt safe enough to relax. I still couldn't get the image of the figure out of my head. Had they been real? Or was it just my mind playing tricks on me in the snowstorm? Either way, I didn't care. All I knew was that I was no longer in the car and I was no longer alone in the storm. The next morning, the snowstorm had passed. The roads were still treacherous, but I could see clearly now, and there was no sign of the figure. I made my way back to the main road, my hands still trembling on the wheel. I never found out who that person was or whether they had been real. But every time I drive through the mountains, I can't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there with me in the storm. And I'll never forget how close I came to being completely alone. It was just an ordinary Tuesday evening. I had gotten off work late, tired from a long day in front of the computer screen, and I was looking forward to a quiet night at home. The apartment was small, but it was cozy and all mine. I had a cup of tea in hand, my favorite book on the coffee table, and the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background. It was the kind of night I lived for, simple, uneventful, and peaceful. I was just about to settle into the couch when I heard a knock at the door. It was sharp, persistent. I glanced at the clock, 9:30 p.m. A little late for anyone I knew to be visiting, but not so late that it would be unusual for a neighbor to stop by. I had only lived in the building for a few months, and though I had exchanged pleasantries with a few of the other tenants, I didn't have anyone I could call a close friend. The knock came again, louder this time. I set my tea down and walked to the door, peeking through the peephole. There was a man standing outside, his back turned to me. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and holding something in his hand, but I couldn't see what it was. I felt a moment of hesitation. Something about his posture seemed off, like he was waiting for me to open the door rather than just knocking. I stepped back from the door, debating whether I should answer. I didn't recognize him, and I wasn't expecting anyone. But then again, it was possible it was a neighbor with a package or something. I opened the door just a crack, enough to speak to him without fully exposing myself. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The man turned slowly, his face blank, as if he were considering how to respond. Then, after what felt like an eternity of silence, he spoke. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said in a low voice. "I'm looking for a friend of mine. I think they live here in this building." I tilted my head slightly, puzzled. "Who's your friend?" I asked. "What apartment are they in?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced down at his shoes as though he were trying to recall the details. The pause grew uncomfortable, and I felt a sudden chill despite the warm apartment. "I don't remember their name. I've lost touch with them," he finally said, his voice trailing off. "But I'm sure they live here. I just wanted to check. Do you know if anyone lives in 3B? I frowned. "I don't know who lives in 3B, I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "I'm in 2B. You might want to try asking the landlord or someone else in the building." The man nodded, his face expressionless. He turned away from me without another word and started to walk down the hall. I stood there for a moment, staring at his retreating figure, feeling a deep sense of unease creep up my spine. Something didn't feel right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I shut the door, double-locked it, and walked back to the living room, trying to shake off the weird feeling that lingered. I had lived in the building long enough to know the tenants were quiet, and there had never been any trouble. No complaints, no incidents. But something about that man made me nervous. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the unease wouldn't leave. Every time I glanced at the door, I expected to see him standing there again. I checked the locks twice more before sitting back down, trying to focus on my book. But my thoughts kept drifting back to that man. Half an hour later, I heard a soft knock on the door again. I froze. My pulse quickened. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to open it or not. This time, I didn't look through the peephole. I just stood there listening to the knocking. It wasn't forceful, but it was deliberate. 3 knocks. Pause. Another 3 knocks. I took a deep breath and walked slowly to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood there for a long moment, unable to move, not knowing what to do. What if it was the same man? Or worse, what if it was someone else? I reached for the door handle, but then something made me hesitate. The knocking stopped. For a few moments, everything was silent. I waited, but nothing happened. I slowly leaned against the door, trying to decide if I should open it. That's when I heard a voice. Soft, barely a whisper, coming from the other side of the door. "You shouldn't have locked the door." I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was low, almost a murmur, but it was unmistakable. It was the same man. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The blood drained from my face as I stood there in the dark hallway, staring at the door. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end. I felt like I was suffocating. Seconds passed, but it felt like an eternity. Then suddenly I heard the sound of footsteps retreating down the hall. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My mind was racing. Was he gone? Or was he still standing out there, waiting? I waited for what felt like forever before slowly turning off the lights and retreating into my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I kept the lights off, listening for any sign of movement in the hall. The rest of the night passed without incident, but sleep was impossible. The unease lingered, and every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the whisper, "You shouldn't have locked the door." The next morning I checked the hallway. There was no sign of anyone. No strange footprints. No sign of anything unusual. The man had vanished. I never saw him again, but I've never forgotten his voice, or the feeling that I wasn't alone, even when I was in my own apartment. To this day, I still don't know who he was or what he wanted. But I learned a hard lesson that night. Sometimes it's better not to answer the door at all. I had been looking forward to the weekend retreat for weeks. After months of stressful work, I wanted nothing more than to get away from everything and recharge. My friends and I rented a remote cabin in the woods, far from any town or city, hoping for peace and quiet. The place was isolated, just a small 2-story cabin surrounded by dense forest on all sides. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, just us and nature. We arrived late Friday afternoon and everything seemed perfect. The air was crisp, the smell of pine and earth fresh in our lungs. The cabin was exactly what we had hoped for, rustic but comfortable. It was surrounded by thick trees, and the only sounds were the wind rustling through the branches and the occasional bird call. There was no other sign of life, no other cabins in sight. We were alone in the woods, just how we wanted it. The first night was uneventful. We sat around the fire pit, shared some drinks, told stories, and enjoyed the quiet. As darkness settled, we headed inside, closing the door behind us. There were only a few lights inside, casting shadows across the wooden walls. We all went to bed early, wanting to wake up refreshed the next morning. It was around 2 a.m. when I was jolted awake. At first, I couldn't place the sound. It was faint, almost like a distant tapping, but it was rhythmic and persistent. I rolled over in bed and listened for a moment, straining to hear past the usual sounds of the wind outside. But it was still there, tap, 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 like someone knocking lightly at the door. I convinced myself that it was probably an animal or something in the woods, maybe a branch hitting the window. I pulled the covers over my head and tried to go back to sleep. But the tapping continued, and it wasn't just on the door anymore. It was coming from the walls, the ceiling. It sounded as though someone was walking around the cabin. I lay there, frozen, listening. The more I listened, the more certain I became that it wasn't just the wind or an animal. The sound was deliberate, methodical. It wasn't until the tapping stopped and the silence settled in again that I realized something else. I hadn't heard anyone else move in the cabin. My friends were still asleep, oblivious to the sounds I had been hearing. I got out of bed cautiously, tiptoeing to the door. I opened it quietly and looked into the dark hallway. Everything was still. The moonlight filtered in through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor. I stepped out into the hallway and crept to the living room, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know why I thought it would be a good idea to investigate. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining things. But as I approached the living room, the air grew colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. That's when I noticed it. The front door, which I was sure I had locked when we arrived, was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I rushed back to the others' rooms and shook them awake. "Guys, wake up," I whispered urgently. "Something's wrong." They were groggy but soon realized I wasn't joking. We all stood in the living room, silently listening for any sounds. Nothing. The house was eerily quiet again, but the door was wide open now, and the thought of someone, or something, being in the house with us made my blood run cold. We locked the door and checked the rest of the cabin, but nothing seemed out of place. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We debated whether to leave, but it was pitch dark outside, and we were miles away from the nearest town. Besides, nothing had happened. There were no signs of anyone being there. It had to be our imagination, right? We went back to bed, but no one slept well that night. The tapping came again, only this time it was louder. And it wasn't just on the walls, it was coming from the floorboards beneath us. I could feel it now, a low thrum, almost as if the cabin itself were pulsing with some kind of energy. I could hear each of my friends turning restlessly in their beds, clearly disturbed by the noise, but no one said anything. Everyone was too afraid to speak. The next morning we were all on edge. We decided to go for a hike, hoping the fresh air would clear our minds. As we packed up our bags, I happened to glance out the window towards the woods behind the cabin. The trees seemed unnaturally still, as if they were waiting for something. That's when I saw it, a figure standing just on the edge of the tree line. A man, dressed in dark clothes, barely visible in the shadows. I blinked, and when I looked back, he was gone. I didn't say anything to the others at first. I didn't want to freak them out, but my heart was racing. We left for the hike, but I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting the man to appear again. He never did. That night, we decided to leave early. We packed our things, but when we went outside to load up the car, we noticed something strange. There were muddy footprints leading away from the cabin, heading toward the woods. They were fresh, only a few hours old, but no one had gone outside. We left the cabin as quickly as we could, and as we drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following us. But there was nothing, just the road disappearing into the trees. I don't know who or what was in that cabin with us, but I will never go back there. The woods were too quiet, the tapping too deliberate. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Whatever was in those woods didn't want us there. And next time, if there is a next time, I will listen to that feeling in my gut and stay far, far away. I never thought I'd end up in such a terrifying situation. It all started when I decided to take a solo trip to the mountains. I had always loved the idea of being completely alone in nature, away from the hustle and bustle of daily life. I booked a small cabin in a remote area, planning to spend a few peaceful days hiking, reading, and recharging my batteries. Little did I know, the peace I sought would soon turn into a nightmare. The first day was perfect. The weather was crisp and clear, and I spent most of the afternoon exploring the surrounding trails. When I returned to the cabin, I felt a deep sense of calm. The silence was so thick that it almost felt like the mountains themselves were holding their breath. I made a simple dinner, lit a fire in the wood stove, and settled in with a book as the sun began to set. The whole place felt like a peaceful retreat, a sanctuary far from civilization. That night, a storm rolled in unexpectedly. I had checked the weather forecast before coming, and there was no mention of any storms, but nature is unpredictable. The wind picked up, and soon enough, I could hear the first crack of thunder echoing across the valley. I wasn't worried. Storms were a regular occurrence in the mountains. Still, the power went out, and I was left alone in the dark except for the flickering light from the fire. At first, I wasn't concerned. I had a flashlight and I'd brought extra candles so I could still make myself comfortable. But as the wind howled outside and the storm intensified, something strange started to happen. I began to hear noises, subtle at first, just a slight tapping against the windows. I chalked it up to branches being blown by the wind, or maybe the house settling in the storm. But as the tapping grew more persistent, I started to feel uneasy. Around midnight, I decided to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and walked around the cabin, shining the beam through the windows. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. When I turned to walk back inside, I froze. There, on the other side of the window, was a face. A man. Standing still in the heavy rain, just staring at me. I screamed and stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The man didn't move, just stood there in the dark, his face expressionless. He wasn't knocking, he wasn't trying to get my attention. He was simply there, watching. I couldn't see his features clearly, but the coldness of his gaze sent a shiver down my spine. I rushed inside and locked the door behind me, breathing heavily. I called the police, but there was no signal, no surprise given how far out I was. My phone was useless, and the storm made it impossible for me to drive out. I tried to calm myself down, thinking that maybe it was just some lost hiker or another traveler caught in the storm. Perhaps they were just trying to get my attention for help. But as the hours passed, the storm raged on, and the figure never left. I caught glimpses of him from the window every so often, standing just outside, never approaching, just staring. My mind raced with thoughts. Who was he? What did he want? Was he really alone? Could there be more people out there hiding in the storm? Around 2 a.m. the tapping resumed. This time it was louder and closer. Someone was at the door. I could feel my heart in my throat. The tapping was deliberate now, slow and rhythmic. I sat frozen in the dark, listening. The wind screamed outside, but in that moment, everything else seemed silent. I slowly moved to the door, gathering all my courage, and peeked through the peephole. Nothing. But then a shape moved in the shadows just outside the door. It was him again. The man. He was crouching near the porch, his face turned away from the light. I didn't know what to do. Should I confront him? Should I try to escape? But I couldn't leave. The road out was blocked by snow drifts, and I wasn't about to step outside into the storm. I sat there in the darkness, my mind racing, until I finally heard a sound I hadn't expected. Voices. Soft, muffled voices coming from somewhere outside. They were faint, but there were more of them now, speaking in low tones. Panic surged through me as I realized I wasn't alone in this cabin anymore. Whoever this man was, he wasn't by himself. The voices grew louder, and I realized that they weren't just random words. They were calling my name. "Come outside," one of the voices said. "We know you're in there. It's safe." My breath caught in my chest. The man wasn't alone. There were more people out there, and they knew I was inside. I couldn't stay here anymore. The fear that had been creeping up on me now consumed me entirely. I had no choice but to escape. I gathered what little I could and prepared to leave the cabin. My only chance was to make it to the car and drive as far away as possible. I crept toward the back door, praying I wouldn't make a sound. The wind howled louder as I slowly opened the door and stepped outside. The snow had piled up against the cabin, and the storm was even worse than before. I sprinted through the thick snow, praying my legs wouldn't give out. Behind me I heard footsteps, steady, deliberate. They were following me. By some miracle I made it to my car, started it, and drove away. But as I looked in my rearview mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The cabin was still there, and through the window I could see him, the man, still standing there, staring into the night. I had been driving for hours, the road stretching endlessly in front of me, with nothing but flat farmland and the occasional dilapidated barn dotting the horizon. The weather was unbearable, so humid that the air felt thick, making it hard to breathe, and the occasional gusts of wind only added to the discomfort. I was headed to a small town for a weekend visit, but the longer I drove on that lonely highway, the more I began to question my decision to take this route. It was the kind of road that went on forever, with no signs of civilization for miles, and it seemed I was the only one foolish enough to travel it at this hour. Around 10 p.m., my car started to sputter. At first, I thought it was just the heat getting to the engine, but when the lights dimmed and the engine coughed and died, I realized I was in serious trouble. I tried to restart the car, but it was no use. The road was deserted and I had no cell service, no way to call for help. I checked the gas gauge, but that wasn't the issue. The car was simply broken and I was stuck. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the car. The oppressive heat of the day had died down, but now the night air felt stifling, as if the surrounding land was holding its breath. I walked a little ways to see if there was a nearby gas station or any sign of life. There was nothing, just the endless stretch of highway. After a while, I started to think about hitching a ride to the nearest town. I wasn't far off from a small town according to the map I had, but walking in the dark didn't seem like a good idea, especially without any light to guide me. It was when I turned back toward my car that I saw headlights in the distance. A vehicle was coming toward me, slowly. Relief flooded through me. Finally, some help. The car pulled up next to mine and the driver rolled down his window. He was a man in his late 40s with short cropped hair and a scruffy beard. He wore sunglasses despite the night, and his eyes were hidden behind the dark lenses. There was something strange about his expression, distant, unreadable, but I didn't have time to think too much about it. I was just happy to see someone. "Need a lift?" he asked, his voice deep and gravelly. "Yeah, my car broke down and I'm trying to get to the nearest town. Do you know how far it is?" I replied. He nodded, his gaze never leaving me. "It's not far. I can give you a ride." I hesitated for a moment. Something felt off, but my options were limited. I was in the middle of nowhere, and I didn't know how long I'd be waiting if I turned him down. So I climbed into his car, trying to ignore the sense of unease creeping over me. As we drove, the man didn't say much, and neither did I. The radio was tuned to a static-filled station, the low hum of the engine and the occasional bump in the road filling the silence. I couldn't help but glance at him every now and then, noticing that he was gripping the steering wheel a bit too tightly. His knuckles were white and his jaw was clenched, but still he didn't speak. A few minutes into the drive, I asked, "Do you live around here?" The man didn't immediately respond, which made the silence feel even more awkward. Finally, he said, "I travel a lot, mostly on these back roads. Not many people out here." I nodded, unsure how to continue the conversation. I glanced out the window, trying to distract myself from the growing tension in the car. But then something caught my eye. The side mirror. It seemed to show a car following us. I turned my head quickly, but when I looked, there was nothing behind us. Just the dark road. I must have imagined it. The fatigue from the long drive was getting to me. But then I noticed something else. The man had taken a sharp turn off the main highway into a smaller, even more desolate road. It was barely a path, with overgrown weeds and dirt. I didn't recognize the area at all. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man didn't answer immediately. He simply kept driving down the road, his eyes focused straight ahead. The car began to slow down and I felt my pulse quicken. "I think I'll get out here," I said, my voice wavering slightly. He finally glanced over at me, his face unreadable. "Don't worry," he said. "We're almost there." The unsettling feeling in my stomach grew, but before I could protest further, the car slowed to a stop. I looked around and we were surrounded by dense trees. There were no lights, no signs of any town or buildings. It was just the dark wilderness. He turned off the engine and looked at me, his expression still hidden behind those dark sunglasses. "You're safe here," he said in a strange tone. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The handle wouldn't turn. Panic surged through me as I realized that the man wasn't trying to help me after all. He had brought me here for a reason. "Let me out," I demanded, my voice trembling now. He just stared at me, not moving, his face cold and emotionless. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "You should have listened to your instincts," he said, his voice low, almost like a whisper. "You shouldn't have gotten in." I didn't know what he meant by that, but I knew I had to get out of the car. I shoved against the door again, and this time it opened. I bolted out into the woods, running blindly, the sound of my footsteps loud in my ears. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel his presence following me, and I could hear the faint hum of the engine starting again in the distance. Eventually, I stumbled across another road, and a passing truck stopped to help me. The driver, an older man, took me to the nearest town. When I finally arrived, safe and shaken, I couldn't help but think back to the stranger in the car. Who was he? And what would have happened if I had stayed? I'll never know. But one thing's for sure, I'll never again take a ride from a stranger on a lonely highway. It had been a long week of work, and I was more than ready for a break. The beach resort on the coast seemed like the perfect place to unwind, especially in the off-season when the crowds had thinned out. My plan was simple: relax, read, and enjoy the calm waves rolling in at sunset. What I didn't expect was that my vacation would turn into a nightmare I could never shake off. I arrived at the resort around 4 p.m., after a long drive along winding coastal roads. The place was exactly as I had hoped: quiet, secluded, and with the rhythmic sound of the ocean just beyond the hotel's tall windows. I checked in at the reception, where the friendly woman behind the counter handed me a key and mentioned that the resort had few guests during the off-season, but she assured me it was still fully staffed. She also mentioned something strange: if I saw a man wandering around the resort after hours, not to engage with him. I thought it was odd, but she gave no further explanation and smiled as she handed me the key. My room had a balcony overlooking the beach. It was a beautiful sight. As I unpacked, I admired the view and felt the weight of my stress begin to lift. I went down to the bar for a drink, but the place was nearly empty. Just a couple in the corner, sipping wine, and an elderly man sitting at the bar. The bartender greeted me with a warm smile, though there was a faint unease in his eyes, something I couldn't place. I sat at a table, ordered a gin and tonic, and tried to enjoy the silence. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was off about the resort. At first, I assumed it was just my overactive imagination or the stillness of the place making me feel jumpy. Around 9 p.m., as the sun dipped below the horizon, I took a walk along the beach. The moonlight reflected off the gentle waves, casting an eerie glow over the sand. I was alone, save for a few scattered seagulls. The beach was desolate and peaceful, but as I walked further down the shore, I saw someone in the distance. A figure standing just at the edge of the water, facing the ocean. He was tall and thin, dressed in a long dark coat that seemed out of place for the warm evening. I could barely make out his features, but the way he stood there, unmoving, made me feel uneasy. Curious, I approached, but when I got close enough, the figure suddenly turned and walked toward the dunes, disappearing into the darkness. It struck me as odd. Who would be out there at that hour in such strange clothing? I was just about to head back when I noticed a peculiar detail. There was no sound. No footsteps, no rustling of clothing. Just an eerie, unnatural silence. I returned to the resort and didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just a local wandering the beach at night. However, as I reached the hotel, I saw the same man standing just outside the front entrance. His back was to me, and again he didn't seem to acknowledge my presence. I tried to ignore him, walking past him toward the elevator, but something about his stillness made my skin crawl. I took the elevator up to my room, not daring to look back. When the doors closed, I felt a strange sense of relief. Back in my room, I tried to shake off the unease and settle into the comforts of the night. I turned on the TV and lay in bed, trying to distract myself from the thoughts of the strange man. But just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard a faint knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. I cautiously walked to the door, peering through the peephole. There, standing in the hallway, was the same man. His face was still obscured by the shadows, but there was no mistaking him. He was standing completely still, staring at the door as if he knew I was watching. I didn't open the door. I didn't say anything. I just backed away, my breath quickening. I could feel the thudding of my heartbeat in my ears. The knock came again, this time louder and more insistent. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the front desk? Should I open the door and confront him? I tried calling the reception, but the line went straight to voicemail. I checked the clock, 11:30 p.m. The hotel seemed eerily quiet, too quiet. The knocking continued, growing louder with each strike. I was paralyzed with fear. Finally, I gathered the courage to look through the peephole again, and to my horror, the man had moved closer. His face was now directly in front of the door, his features twisted into a grimace. His eyes, cold and lifeless, stared into mine. I froze, unable to look away. Then, without warning, he turned and walked down the hallway, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there for what felt like hours, unable to move. Eventually, I called the front desk, but when I told the woman what happened, she responded with a surprising calmness. "You've met him, haven't you?" she asked softly. "He's been wandering the resort for years, but he never stays. He always leaves before morning." I was speechless. I asked who he was, but she simply told me, "He's not real. But you'll always know him when you see him. He'll be gone by sunrise." The next morning I checked out early, my nerves frazzled, my mind still racing. I never saw the man again, nor did I find any sign that he had ever been there. It was as if he had vanished, leaving no trace. As I drove away, leaving the empty resort behind me, I couldn't help but wonder. Was he a ghost of the past, a figment of my imagination, or something far worse? Whatever he was, I knew one thing for sure: I would never return to that resort again. I had rented a small, secluded cabin in the mountains for a week of solitude. It was the perfect place to escape from the stresses of city life. The cabin was tucked away in the woods, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by tall pine trees and the quiet hum of nature. I had the entire place to myself. No neighbors, no distractions. The only company I expected was the occasional chirp of birds and the rustling of leaves. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The air was crisp, the smell of pine fresh and invigorating. The cabin was exactly what I had hoped for: rustic, cozy, and with a stone fireplace that gave the entire room a warm, welcoming glow. The last thing I wanted was any kind of disturbance, so I relished in the peace and quiet. The first evening passed uneventfully. I made a simple dinner, sat on the porch to watch the stars, and went to bed early, ready to start fresh the next day. It was only on the second day that things started to get strange. I woke up early to the sound of something scraping against the wooden walls. It was a subtle noise, but enough to pull me out of my sleep. At first, I thought it was just the wind or perhaps an animal, but as the noise persisted, I started to feel uneasy. I checked the windows and doors to make sure everything was secure, but there was nothing unusual. No sign of an animal, no branches scraping against the cabin. I brushed it off as my imagination and decided to go for a hike. The mountain trails were known for their beauty, and I wanted to enjoy the isolation, so I set off down one of the paths leading through the forest. The air was still, the only sound the crunch of fallen leaves beneath my boots. I spent a few hours walking, getting lost in the peaceful solitude. When I returned to the cabin, everything seemed normal again, except for the small detail I noticed when I entered the living room. The front door was slightly ajar. I was certain that I had locked it when I left. I would have remembered leaving it open, but there was an inch or two of space between the door frame and the door itself. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. I stepped inside cautiously, expecting the worst. My heart raced, but everything appeared to be in its place. Nothing was missing, no signs of forced entry, no sign of a break-in. Still, the door was ajar. I closed it and locked it again, thinking perhaps I had simply forgotten. But something nagged at me. There was a feeling that I wasn't alone. As the days passed, the feeling of being watched grew. I would hear footsteps outside the cabin when I was inside, but when I checked, there was no one there. Sometimes I'd hear something heavy dragging across the ground, like a piece of furniture being moved, but again I would find nothing out of place. On the fourth night, I was sitting by the fire when I heard a knock at the door. I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I hadn't seen another soul in days. The thought of opening the door to some stranger in the middle of nowhere was terrifying. I stayed quiet, hoping whoever it was would leave, but the knocking persisted, becoming more frantic with each strike. The sound echoed through the cabin, loud and insistent. I finally summoned the courage to peek through the window. What I saw chilled me to my core. There was a man standing in the yard just beyond the porch. He was tall, his face obscured by the shadows, but I could tell he was looking directly at me. He didn't move, just stood there staring at the cabin. I could feel his gaze piercing through the window as though he knew I was watching him. My mind raced. Who was he? How had he gotten up here? I called the local authorities, but they told me it would take hours for them to reach me. They advised me to lock the doors and windows and wait for them to arrive. I did as they said, but the fear only grew. I couldn't stop looking out the window, but by the time I gathered the courage to peek again, he was gone. The knocking stopped, but the silence that followed felt worse than the noise. I sat by the window trying to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak and groan of the cabin made me jump, my nerves on edge. When morning finally came, I rushed outside to check the perimeter of the cabin, but there was no sign of anyone. The yard was empty. There was no trace of the man who had been standing there the night before. The rest of the day passed without incident, but by the time nightfall came, I was already packed and ready to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and I wasn't willing to wait around to see if the man would return. As I drove away from the cabin, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing in the doorway watching me drive off. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I'll never forget the way he stood there, staring at me from the darkness. The cabin was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, but it turned into a nightmare I couldn't escape from fast enough. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway, a weekend camping trip in the woods. I had always loved the idea of disconnecting from the world, escaping the noise of daily life, and immersing myself in nature. The campsite I chose was a remote spot, deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town. There were no crowds, no distractions, just me, the tent, and the woods. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun beginning to set behind the trees. The air was cool, the scent of pine and earth filling my lungs as I set up camp. I pitched my tent near a small stream that ran through the area, the soft sound of running water adding to the serenity. After setting up, I gathered some firewood and built a small fire to cook my dinner. It was peaceful, just as I had imagined. As night fell and the fire crackled, I sat back in my camp chair, watching the stars slowly appear in the sky. The only sounds were the wind rustling the leaves and the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the stream. I had no intention of going anywhere. The plan was simple: enjoy the solitude, have some quiet time away from everything, and leave my phone off. As the night grew darker, I began to hear something strange. At first, it was faint, just a slight rustling in the bushes near the edge of the campsite. I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was a deer or a raccoon, just some animal going about its business. But the rustling continued, and then I heard something else, a faint thud like footsteps on the ground. I turned around, scanning the dark perimeter of the camp. I saw nothing. The shadows of the trees loomed large, but there was no movement, no sign of any animal. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, the kind of thing that happens when you're alone in the woods. surrounded by the unknown. But then it happened again, this time louder. It was definitely footsteps. Someone was walking around the edge of my campsite. My heart began to race. I stood up slowly, my eyes glued to the dark shadows around me. The footsteps stopped and there was a long pause. I held my breath, waiting. Nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just a figment of my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark. I decided to head into my tent just to be safe. I was on edge, but I tried to calm myself down, telling myself I was being ridiculous. The night was quiet again, almost too quiet. I zipped up the tent, laid down in my sleeping bag and tried to get some rest. That's when I heard it, this time much closer. A faint rustling like something brushing against the tent. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. I lay still, listening carefully. The rustling came again, this time louder, and then soft, uneven breathing like someone was standing right outside my tent, just inches away from me. I didn't dare move. I was paralyzed with fear, trying to keep my breathing steady so the person outside wouldn't hear me. My mind raced. Who would be out here in the woods this late at night? There were no other campers around. This area was secluded, far from any main trails or roads. I grabbed my flashlight from my bag, turning it on as quietly as I could. Holding it in one hand, I unzipped the tent just a little, just enough to peer out. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, illuminating the ground in front of me. Nothing. I scanned the area, moving the beam slowly across the campsite, but there was no one there. No figure in the shadows, no movement. Only the dark forest, silent and still. Relieved but still uneasy, I zipped the tent shut again and tried to convince myself I had imagined the whole thing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept my flashlight on, my senses on high alert. As I lay there in the tent, every tiny sound seemed amplified in the silence. The wind, the distant sound of the stream, even my own breathing felt loud. I didn't sleep that night, not really. I kept hearing things. Footsteps, rustling, the feeling of someone or something just outside. By the time morning came, I was exhausted and on edge. I packed up my things quickly, not even bothering to make breakfast. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there all night, watching me. As I was packing up my tent, I noticed something strange. A small, half-buried object near the edge of the campsite. A rock, it seemed. But when I brushed some dirt off it, I realized it was something much more disturbing. A pair of worn, muddy boots, the kind you might wear for hiking or camping, had been partially hidden beneath the dirt. Whoever had been out there had been close enough to leave their shoes behind. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't stick around long enough to investigate further. I grabbed my things and left, driving away as quickly as I could. I don't know who was out there or why they were watching me. But I'll never forget the feeling of someone breathing right outside my tent, or the sight of those muddy boots half buried in the dirt. Something tells me I wasn't alone in the forest that night, and that thought still haunts me. I had never planned on being stranded on a small, desolate island, but that's exactly what happened. After a violent storm capsized the boat I was on, I was left drifting alone in the open ocean for days before finally washing ashore. The island was isolated, surrounded by nothing but the vast expanse of water. There were no signs of life, no civilization. My phone was dead and there wasn't another soul for miles. For the first few days, I focused on survival. I found fresh water, hunted for food, and tried to make a shelter with what little I had. The scorching sun beat down on me during the day and the nights were cold. My thoughts started to cloud with desperation as I realized how far I was from help, how remote this island was. I tried to stay hopeful, but each passing day made that hope seem more fragile. By the 7th day, I had come to terms with my fate. There was no rescue. There was no point in waiting for something that wasn't going to happen. I had explored every inch of the island. There were no hidden paths, no signs of anyone else. This place was a forgotten patch of earth, untouched by people for years, maybe even decades. But then, on the morning of the 8th day, something unexpected happened. A boat appeared on the horizon. At first, I thought it was a mirage, something conjured by my sun-scorched mind. But as it got closer, I saw it was real. A small, weathered boat with a single man aboard. My heart skipped a beat. Finally, after all this time, someone had come to rescue me. The boat slowly made its way to the shore. The man, dressed in tattered clothes, seemed exhausted, but his movements were calm. I watched him approach the beach, my chest tight with relief. He was the first person I had seen in days, the first sign of hope in what felt like an endless nightmare. The man docked the boat a little distance from where I stood, and as he walked toward me, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease. There was something about his slow, deliberate movements that made me hesitate. His eyes were hollow, distant, and when he smiled, it didn't reach them. The smile seemed forced, like a mask he wore to hide something darker. I couldn't place it at first, but the feeling in the pit of my stomach grew as he got closer. He didn't speak, just stared at me for a long time before his lips parted. His voice, when it finally came, was rough, distant, and oddly detached. He asked if I was all right, if I was hurt, but there was something about the way he said it, too calm, too measured, that made me feel more uneasy than comforted. I told him what had happened, how the storm had struck, how I'd been drifting for days. He nodded as if he understood all too well, but there was no sense of urgency in his words or his actions. He seemed unconcerned, almost as if he had no reason to hurry. Then, without warning, he reached down to his waist and pulled something from his belt. At first, I thought it was a tool or something necessary for the boat, but as he held it out, I realized it was a knife. My stomach lurched, and every alarm in my body went off at once. I froze. My heart began to pound as the reality of the situation settled in. This man wasn't here to rescue me. He wasn't here to help. The knife gleamed in the weak morning light as he approached slowly, the same hollow look in his eyes. It was at that moment that everything changed. I had been too blinded by my own desperation to see it before, but now it was painfully clear. This man wasn't a savior. He was another threat in this endless nightmare. I was no longer stranded on an island. I was trapped in a situation far worse than anything I had imagined. My instincts kicked in. I turned without thinking, bolting toward the dense jungle at the far side of the beach. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps slow but deliberate, like he wasn't even in a hurry. It was a terrifying thought. He didn't need to rush. He knew he had time. He knew he could catch me. The sand was soft beneath my feet, making it harder to run, but I didn't stop. I pushed my body forward, lungs burning, heart racing, until I reached the trees. The thick underbrush slowed me down, but I didn't care. I needed to lose him. I didn't know how long I ran, minutes? Hours? But eventually, I found myself deeper into the jungle than I had ever been before. The trees loomed tall around me, their shadows long and dark as the sun rose higher in the sky. The air was thick, heavy with moisture, but I couldn't stop to rest. I couldn't risk it. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet, the rustle of leaves, the snapping of twigs, and I was sure he was still out there, watching, waiting. I found a small, secluded area in the jungle, crouching behind a thick cluster of ferns. I stayed there, barely breathing for what felt like hours. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. When I finally ventured back toward the beach, the man and his boat were gone. I didn't trust that he had left. I didn't trust that this was over. But I couldn't risk staying where I was any longer. I moved deeper into the island, hoping to find another way off, but I never saw that boat again. For the next few days, I stayed hidden, always on the lookout. I stayed in the jungle, avoiding the beach, avoiding the places I had once considered safe. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I knew one thing for sure. I had been lucky to escape. The island was no longer a place of isolation. It was a trap. And somehow I had been pulled into it. The rescue I had waited for wasn't a rescue at all. It was a test, a moment of pure terror, one that would haunt me for as long as I lived. was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway. I'd been working nonstop for months, and I desperately needed a break from the hustle of the city. So when I found a secluded cabin by a lake deep in the woods, I thought it was the perfect place to relax, disconnect, and recharge. The cabin was small and weathered, but it had charm, if you could call it that. It was isolated, tucked away in a patch of trees that overlooked a serene, calm lake. The water was so still it mirrored the sky, and the silence around me was so complete that it felt almost unnatural. I had driven hours to get there, and as I parked in front of the cabin, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over me. No cell service, no distractions, just me and nature. The first evening was peaceful. The cabin was basic: an old fireplace, a small kitchen, a single bedroom with an antique bed, and a creaky wooden floor that seemed to sigh under my feet. I didn't mind the rustic feel. In fact, it added to the charm. I spent the night in front of the fire, reading a book I'd brought along and enjoying the crackling sounds of the flames. The only disturbance was the occasional rustling of leaves outside, but that didn't bother me. It was just the wind, I told myself. The next morning, the weather turned. It started with a light drizzle, but by midday, the rain became heavier. The air grew colder, and the trees around the cabin swayed violently in the wind. I had planned on hiking, but the storm made that impossible. So I decided to stay inside and explore the cabin a bit more. I was rummaging through the small closet when I found an old journal buried at the back. It was leather-bound and looked ancient, the pages yellowed with age. The handwriting inside was faint, but it was readable. The entries began innocently enough. Someone had stayed in the cabin years ago, written about simple things: the weather, the lake, the solitude. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone of the journal changed. The entries grew darker, more unsettling. The writer began to talk about strange noises at night, scratching sounds that seemed to come from the walls. The writer noted feeling watched, hearing whispers when no one was around. The entries grew erratic, and the last few pages were nothing but frantic scribbles. I sat back, my heart racing. The journal seemed to be a detailed account of someone slowly losing their grip on reality. Or perhaps they had been driven to madness by something else. But what? I decided to leave the journal where I found it. But after reading it, I felt a strange sense of unease settle over me. The air in the cabin felt thicker, as if the storm outside was creeping inside with it. Later that evening, as the storm raged outside, I tried to shake off the feeling. The rain battered the windows, the wind howled, and every now and then the power flickered. I was curled up on the couch, trying to distract myself with a movie when I heard it. A soft thud, then another. It came from the attic. At first, I thought it was the house settling, the usual creaks and groans of an old building. But then there was another noise, sharper this time, like something dragging across the floor. I froze. I told myself it was just the storm. Maybe the wind was making the old house shift. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The attic was dark, and the stairs creaked loudly underfoot as I climbed up to investigate. The small window at the top of the stairs revealed nothing but darkness outside, with the trees swaying violently in the wind. I couldn't see anything strange up there, but the unease only grew stronger. As I turned to leave, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow flickered in the far corner of the attic. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. I was done. I didn't care what it was. I wasn't sticking around to find out. That night, the wind howled louder than before, and the rain seemed to come down even harder. I locked all the windows and doors, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I barely slept, every creak of the house making me jump. The shadows in the corners of my room seemed to stretch further, and I kept hearing the faintest rustling noise, like something brushing against the walls. In the morning, the storm had finally passed, but the sense of dread didn't leave. I decided to pack up and leave. The sooner I was out of there, the better. As I was loading my things into the car, I noticed something strange. The lake, which had looked calm and serene when I arrived, now seemed dark and foreboding. The water was rippling even though there was no wind. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the lake. It was a man standing perfectly still, his back to me. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. I called out, but there was no response. I felt a chill run down my spine. Without thinking, I turned and ran to my car, jumping in and speeding away from the cabin as fast as I could. I don't know who that figure was or if it was even real, but the feeling that something was terribly wrong lingered in my mind long after I left. Since then, I've never returned to that cabin. I've heard rumors about the place, stories about its history, about the strange occurrences that have happened there over the years. But I don't care to know anymore. Whatever was in that cabin, whatever I felt, is best left forgotten. I don't know if it was the storm, the isolation, or something else entirely, but I do know one thing for sure. That place was not as empty as it seemed. And whatever was there, I'm glad I left it behind. It was a late night when I decided to drive back home after a long day of work. I had just finished a project in a city an hour away, and the drive was supposed to be an uneventful, straightforward journey down a deserted highway. The kind of drive where you can clear your head, relax, and think, or even zone out. The highway I was on, a long stretch of road that cut through empty fields and isolated towns, wasn't exactly unfamiliar. I had taken it many times before. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving only the headlights of my car to pierce the darkness. The air was still, and the only sounds were the steady hum of the engine and the occasional rattle of the tires against the uneven pavement. But tonight was different. As I drove, I started to notice something unusual. The highway was completely empty, no other cars, no headlights approaching from the opposite direction. It was late, yes, but this stretch of highway usually had at least one or two cars at any given time. But there was nothing. It felt almost too quiet. I pushed it out of my mind, chalking it up to the late hour, and continued driving, focusing on the road ahead. The occasional flicker of light from a distant street lamp or the silhouette of a sign on the side of the road were the only indications that I wasn't completely alone in the world. Yet, the silence around me began to feel heavy, oppressive, as though the entire world had been swallowed up by this stretch of asphalt. Minutes passed. An hour. Still nothing but the hum of my car and the ever-encroaching darkness. My mind started to wander, drifting toward the weird sensation that something was off. I could almost feel it, a subtle pressure in the air, an absence that wasn't quite natural. Every now and then, I would glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights appear in the distance behind me. But there was nothing, just the endless blackness. Then, as I passed a small, unlit rest area, I saw something in the distance, a faint figure standing at the edge of the road. My heart skipped a beat. It was a person. A man standing motionless on the shoulder facing the highway. No jacket, no reflective gear, just a silhouette against the darkened landscape. His posture was stiff, unnervingly so. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge my approach. I thought about stopping, about offering help, but something in my gut told me not to. His stillness felt wrong, unnatural. I kept my foot on the accelerator, not daring to look back. I couldn't shake the image of that man standing there, frozen in place. My eyes flicked nervously back to the road, and I found myself speeding up without realizing it. The only thing I could think about was getting past that stretch of highway as quickly as possible. The atmosphere grew heavier, the air colder. My headlights cut through the darkness, and yet the road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, as if the night was swallowing me whole. That's when I heard it, the faintest whisper, a sound I couldn't place at first. It wasn't coming from the radio, nor could I pinpoint its origin. It was as if the sound was traveling through the very air itself. I thought I was imagining things, but the whispering grew louder, becoming more distinct. I slowed down, looking around frantically, searching for any sign of life, any movement beyond my own car. The road was still empty, and yet I felt like I wasn't alone. The whispering wasn't in any language I recognized. It was soft, indistinct, like a conversation just beyond my hearing range. I stopped the car. For a moment, everything was still again. The whispering had stopped, but the tension in the air remained as thick as fog. I didn't want to get out of the car. I didn't even want to open the windows. But as I sat there, frozen in place, I realized that I wasn't even sure where I was. I glanced at the road signs that had passed, and they all seemed wrong. There was something off about them, like they weren't the usual markers for this stretch of highway. I couldn't remember passing some of them, and yet there they were, as if they had always been there. A creeping fear settled in my chest. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like the road itself was changing. The landscape had become unfamiliar in a way that didn't make sense. I wasn't sure if I was driving in circles or if the road had simply distorted, as if I had driven through some unseen barrier. I'd passed the same rest area multiple times, the same dark silhouette still standing there, unmoving. With my heart pounding, I slammed the car into reverse and turned around. I needed to go back to where I came from. I was desperate to get off that stretch of highway, to break whatever unnatural hold it had over me. But as I drove in the opposite direction, I saw something that froze me in place. A figure standing in the middle of the road, blocking my way. The same man. The one I'd seen earlier. But this time he wasn't still. He was moving, slowly, almost imperceptibly, his body jerking unnaturally, like he was being pulled forward by some invisible force. His face, though still shrouded in darkness, seemed to tilt toward me, and that's when I saw it. His eyes. They were wide open, unblinking, and lifeless. I panicked. I slammed the brakes, my heart racing as I swerved to avoid hitting him. When I looked back, the figure had vanished. No trace, no sign that he had ever been there. I quickly turned around again and continued driving, not daring to stop, not daring to look back. I never did figure out what happened that night. I kept driving until I finally saw a sign pointing me toward the nearest town. When I got there, everything seemed normal. The quiet streets, the lights, the shops open as usual. But when I went to the gas station to refuel, the attendant asked me how my trip had gone. "You weren't on the highway, were you?" he asked with a frown. "Yeah, why?" The attendant paused for a moment before replying, "You're lucky you made it out. People sometimes disappear on that road. They say the highway is cursed, I guess. I've never taken that highway again. And every time I pass it, I can't shake the feeling that it's still there waiting, and that the man I saw, or whatever he was, still roams the roads, looking for someone to join him in the silence." I had been driving for hours, the only company being the endless stretch of highway and the faint hum of my car's engine. It had been one of those long days where everything seemed to go wrong, and by the time evening rolled around, I just wanted to find a place to sleep. I hadn't passed many gas stations or rest areas, and the few signs I saw were for towns miles away. At that point, I wasn't picky, I just wanted to get off the road for a while. That's when I saw it. The faded neon sign for a small motel just off the highway. The sign was barely lit, the motel part flickering weakly, but it was a welcome sight after the hours of nothing. I made the turn into the driveway, eager to rest and figure out my next move in the morning. The place looked like it hadn't been in use for a long time. The paint on the buildings was chipped, and there was an eerie stillness about the place. The parking lot was empty, save for a few old cars that looked like they hadn't moved in years. The windows were dark, and the overgrown plants and weeds surrounding the property gave it a rundown, abandoned vibe. But I was tired, and the idea of not having to drive any further appealed to me. I parked the car and got out. The air felt thick, like a storm was coming, but it was completely still. As I approached the entrance, I noticed the door was ajar. I knocked lightly, but there was no answer. I knocked again, and after a few moments, I heard the sound of shuffling footsteps from inside. The door creaked open to reveal an elderly woman standing in the doorway. She looked at me with a tired, almost blank expression. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice low and gravelly. I smiled politely, explaining that I was just passing through and needed a room for the night. She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving mine, as though she were studying me. After a moment, she turned and motioned for me to follow her. The inside of the motel looked even older than the outside. The carpet was stained and the wallpaper was peeling in some places. The faint smell of mildew hung in the air. As she handed me the key to a room at the end of the hall, she gave me one final look, almost as if she was warning me about something. "You'll be safe here," she said, her voice trailing off as I walked down the corridor. I took the key and proceeded to the room. It was small, sparsely furnished, with just a bed, a nightstand, and a lamp that flickered intermittently. The curtains were drawn tightly, and I had the unsettling feeling that the room had not been used in a long time. I set my bag down and sat on the bed, trying to relax. The silence was almost suffocating. It felt like the whole building was holding its breath. I tried to ignore the strange feeling creeping up my spine, telling myself that I was just tired and imagining things. But then I heard something. A soft thud from somewhere above me. I froze, my heart pounding. It was followed by another thud, then a scraping sound like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I held my breath, straining to listen. The noise continued, getting louder, and then inexplicably it stopped. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the hallway, the floor creaking underfoot. The motel was silent once again, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I walked cautiously down the corridor, the shadows stretching unnaturally long in the dim light. When I reached the stairs, I hesitated. The sounds had come from upstairs, but the upper floors looked abandoned. No lights were on, and the hallway was dark and deserted. Against my better judgment, I made my way upstairs. The wooden steps groaned under my weight, and the dim light flickered as I ascended. At the top, I reached the hallway, which was just as quiet as the rest of the building. But as I walked past the first few rooms, I noticed something strange. The doors were all locked from the inside, but there were no signs of life, no voices, no movement. It was then that I noticed the door at the very end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, and there was a faint light coming from within. The door was old, the wood warped, but it beckoned me with an odd sense of familiarity. Against every instinct, I walked toward it. When I pushed the door open, the room inside was completely different from the others. It was immaculate, everything in place, the bed made, the curtains open to let in the moonlight. But there was no one there. The silence was unnerving. I turned to leave but stopped when I saw something that made my blood run cold. A framed photograph on the nightstand. It was an old photo of the motel taken many years ago. The woman who had checked me in was standing in front of the building, but she was younger, and there was another person beside her. A man. I stared at the picture for a long time, and then it hit me. The man in the photo had the same lifeless eyes as the woman. It was as though they were both trapped in time, like the photo was taken decades ago, but they had never aged. Suddenly, I heard the door to the stairwell creak open. My heart leaped into my throat. I rushed back to the hallway, my mind racing. As I rounded the corner, I caught a glimpse of something moving at the end of the hallway, shadowy figures just out of sight. I hurried back to my room, locked the door, and sat in the corner, trying to calm my breathing. I looked around the room, realizing that there was no way out. The windows were shut tight and the door was locked. I tried calling the front desk, but there was no answer. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing tighter and tighter as the shadows grew longer. I could hear the faintest whispering, like the voices of people just beyond my hearing range. It was almost as if the motel itself was alive, and it wanted me to stay. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things and ran, leaving the room behind. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, the engine roaring to life. As I drove away, I glanced back in the rearview mirror. The motel was gone. There was no sign of it. No lights, no neon sign. Just a dark stretch of highway ahead. To this day, I have no idea what happened that night. The motel wasn't on any map, and I could never find it again, no matter how hard I searched. It was as if it had never existed at all. But I know what I saw. And I know one thing for sure, I'll never stop on that stretch of highway again. It was supposed to be a quick detour. I was traveling through a remote part of the country, following a GPS route that I had taken many times before. The drive was long and tiresome, and I had become too accustomed to the quiet stretches of highway that led me deeper into unfamiliar territories. It was the kind of journey where you begin to feel disconnected from the world, as if the road was the only thing that existed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the road I was on veered away from the usual well-maintained highways, leading me down a winding, unlit road surrounded by trees. I had no choice but to follow the signs. The detour was unavoidable. The sign was old and faded, with the words "Bridge Out" in bold red letters. But it was too late to turn back. I had already driven several miles down the road, and turning around now would add at least another hour to my journey. Besides, the detour didn't seem that bad. I hadn't seen any roadblocks or warning signs up ahead. The detour led me to a small bridge, old and weathered but still functional, or so it seemed. The bridge was narrow, with rusted railings and wooden planks that creaked under the weight of my car. A low, murky river flowed beneath it, its surface barely visible in the fading light. I hesitated for a moment as I approached the bridge. It looked far more dilapidated than I had anticipated. The wooden slats were uneven and there were several gaps between the planks. Still, it seemed passable, and I figured that I had no other option but to cross it. I drove slowly, the sound of the wheels scraping against the wooden boards echoing in the silence. The air was thick, and the trees on either side of the bridge created a canopy of shadows, making the already dim light even darker. As I reached the middle of the bridge, I felt a slight tremor, followed by a jolt. My car's suspension groaned, and I quickly pressed on the gas pedal to get to the other side. That's when I heard it, a deep, ominous crack, like the sound of something large snapping under pressure. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I quickly glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the bridge behind me intact, but it wasn't. The back end of my car was hanging precariously over the edge, the tires spinning uselessly in the air as the bridge groaned under my car's weight. I shifted into reverse, panic rising in my chest as I tried to back up. The tires screeched and the car jolted forward, almost falling completely into the river below. With every inch I moved, I could feel the bridge giving way beneath me, the creaks of the wood echoing louder with each passing second. I was stuck. I tried again, this time more violently, slamming the car into reverse and pushing the accelerator to its limit. The tires spun, kicking up debris as the car lurched forward, but I wasn't getting anywhere. The bridge was crumbling and there was no way out. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. I needed to get out of the car. I couldn't stay here, trapped in a vehicle that was slowly slipping into the river. I opened the door, the sound of the metal scraping against the rusted hinges filling the silence. As I stepped out of the car, the bridge shook again, this time much more violently, as if the very foundation was collapsing. The car shifted, and I could see the front end beginning to slide toward the edge. I ran, my legs moving faster than I thought possible, the gravel scraping under my feet as I made my way toward the other side of the bridge. Behind me, I could hear the sound of the bridge splitting apart. The air was thick with dust and the smell of wet wood. I didn't dare look back as I reached the end of the bridge. I just kept running, my breath coming in sharp gasps. When I reached the safety of the other side, I turned and looked at the bridge. It was barely standing, the middle section cracked wide open, with my car now completely dangling over the edge. The wooden planks creaked and groaned as if protesting the weight of the car. I could see the river below, the dark water swirling ominously beneath the crumbling structure. But that wasn't what terrified me the most. There was something else. As I stood there, panting and trembling, I saw a figure standing on the other side of the bridge. A man staring at me from the shadows of the trees, his face barely visible in the low light. He was tall, thin, and dressed in dark clothing, almost blending into the background. But what caught my attention were his eyes, wide, unblinking, and fixed on me. They glowed faintly, almost like a reflection in the dark, and I could feel his gaze piercing through me, as if he knew exactly who I was and what I had just done. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. He didn't even move. He just stood there watching me, his presence more unnerving than any physical threat. I backed away slowly, my feet stumbling on the uneven ground, never taking my eyes off him. My breath was shallow, and I could feel my heartbeat thundering in my ears. But as I turned to run toward my car, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The man was gone. I drove away as fast as I could, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I never stopped to look back. But even now, whenever I cross a bridge or pass an isolated stretch of road, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. That man was real, and whatever had happened on that bridge that night was not just an accident. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I know one thing for sure. The next time I see a bridge out sign, I'll be taking the long way around. I've driven along the highway at night countless times, but that particular trip, late in the evening with the moon barely visible, was different. I was on my way home after a long business meeting, eager to get back to the comfort of my own bed. The drive was smooth, the road wide and almost empty, except for the occasional passing truck or car in the opposite lane. I had no reason to feel uneasy, but something about that night, something about the silence, made me uneasy. It started when I reached the toll booth. I had been on this stretch of road hundreds of times, so I knew the toll booth was coming up. Normally, it would be manned by an attendant or there would be an automated system for paying the fare. But tonight, as I approached, the booth was unoccupied. There were no lights on in the small shack, and the gate to pass through was up, indicating I could drive through without stopping. I figured it was just a quiet night and maybe the attendant was taking a break. It wasn't unusual. These types of stops sometimes went unmanned in the middle of the night. But as I passed the booth, something caught my eye. From the corner of my vision, I saw movement, just a flicker of something shifting behind the booth. I slowed my car, the eerie stillness of the area pressing down on me. There were no other cars in sight, no lights except for the dim glow of the streetlights stretching in either direction. My instincts told me something was off, but I brushed it off as paranoia. The last thing I wanted was to be stuck out here in the dark thinking too much about nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I drove away from the toll booth, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing but an empty stretch of road behind me. But there was something there. A figure standing just outside the booth, partially obscured by the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, just the faintest outline of a person. The figure didn't move, didn't wave, didn't react at all. It was just there. A chill ran down my spine, but I didn't want to stop and find out what it was. I pressed the gas pedal harder, eager to put more distance between myself and that strange scene. The car sped down the empty highway, but no matter how far I drove, that feeling didn't go away. The quiet stretched on. Minutes turned to an hour, but I still couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. My mind wandered back to the figure. Was it just my imagination? Or had I really seen something? I glanced in the mirror again, half expecting to see headlights behind me, but there was nothing. I told myself I was being silly, that it was just a trick of the dark, but my unease was growing. I'd driven this road many times before, but never this late. Never with such a thick silence surrounding me. Then, in an instant, the car engine sputtered. I froze. The sound of the engine stuttered again before falling completely silent. I was still miles away from the next town, miles from any sort of service station. My phone had no signal, and the last thing I wanted to do was get out of the car and walk back down the highway in the dark. But what choice did I have? I tried restarting the car, but nothing happened. The headlights were still on, but the engine refused to turn over. I checked the dashboard, hoping to see something that might explain the issue, but there was nothing. Panic began to set in. I was stuck in the middle of nowhere with no way of contacting anyone. The loneliness of the highway seemed amplified by the stillness of the night. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping on my window. I jerked my head toward the sound, my heart racing. My breath caught in my throat. There was no one outside the car. No one around. The highway stretched on in both directions, empty and silent. Then the tapping came again, this time louder, more insistent. I looked to my left, my hand hovering over the door handle, but there was still no one there. The tapping continued, now coming from the back window, then from the other side. It was as if someone, or something, was walking around my car, gently tapping at every window. But there was nothing visible in the dark outside. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. I pulled open the door, heart pounding, but when I stepped outside, the wind hit me like a wall of ice. I quickly slammed the door shut behind me, checking the car's surroundings. Nothing. No shadows, no movement. Just empty, silent darkness. I walked to the back of the car, trying to steady my breath. The tapping had stopped, but the atmosphere felt even more oppressive now. The faintest hint of a figure again caught my peripheral vision. I turned slowly, and this time, there was someone there. A man stood by the toll booth, staring at me with cold, vacant eyes. His face was pale, and he seemed to be wearing an old uniform, the same kind worn by toll booth attendants, but it looked strange on him, like it didn't fit quite right. He was standing in the exact spot I had seen him earlier, the place where I thought I saw someone in my rearview mirror. And now he was watching me, his expression unreadable. I quickly turned back toward my car, feeling my stomach drop. I reached for the door handle but stopped when I noticed that the car was already started. The engine was running again, the headlights on, and the radio softly playing. I glanced back at the toll booth. The man was gone. I got into the car, slammed the door shut, and sped off without a second thought, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The highway seemed to stretch on forever, but I couldn't look back, not even once. I eventually reached the next town, my heart still pounding, but when I checked the time, hours had passed since I'd stopped at the toll booth. I couldn't explain what happened, and to this day, I don't know what to make of it. But I do know one thing for sure, I never, ever stopped at that toll booth again. And I never will. It was supposed to be a simple, uneventful evening drive. Just me, my car, and the open road. I had recently moved to a small town and was still adjusting to the long, quiet drives between my new home and the city. That night, the weather was perfect, clear skies, no fog, and a cool breeze, ideal for a drive after work. I had decided to take a less traveled route home, a back road I had driven on a couple of times before. It cut through a stretch of woods, which made it feel more isolated but also peaceful. I love the silence out there. The kind of silence that feels alive, like the world is holding its breath. The sun had just set, and the faint orange glow in the sky was starting to fade into dusk. My headlights sliced through the darkness as I drove deeper into the countryside. Everything felt normal at first, but as I passed a small dirt road that forked off the main highway, something caught my attention. A car was parked there, facing the opposite direction. It was an old, rusted sedan, its lights off. Its positioning was odd. It was too far off the road to be simply a car that had broken down, but too close to the trees to seem like a proper parking spot. The car looked out of place. I slowed down instinctively, glancing at the driver's seat. The car appeared empty. No one was inside, and there was no sign of movement. It wasn't unusual for cars to pull off to the side, but this one felt wrong. The longer I looked, the more I felt an unsettling sensation crawl over me, like someone was watching from the darkness. I debated whether I should stop to check on it, but the rational part of me told me not to. It was likely just an abandoned vehicle, and there was no need for me to get involved. So I continued driving, telling myself it was nothing. But the feeling of unease lingered. Minutes later, I glanced back in the rearview mirror. The car was still there, but there was something different. The headlights were on now, illuminating the road behind me in an eerie glow. I frowned, thinking I had imagined it, but as I drove on, I couldn't shake the feeling that the car had somehow moved just slightly. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that the reflection of my own car's lights made it look that way. But then I saw it again. The car was now directly behind me. I slammed my foot on the brake, heart pounding in my chest. There was no way it could have caught up with me that quickly. I had been driving steadily, and the road was mostly straight with no intersections. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, my eyes wide with fear. The sedan was there, just behind me, close enough to make me nervous. I could see the headlights clearly now, but there was no other movement. No sound of an engine revving, no change in the distance between us. It was like the car was perfectly synced with mine. I sped up, hoping to distance myself from it, but no matter how fast I went, the sedan remained right behind me as if tethered to my car. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the trees blurring by, the darkness creeping in on all sides. I could feel my breath quicken as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. I wasn't sure what to do. There was nowhere to pull over, no signs of civilization for miles. Panic began to set in. I tried to make a turn onto a smaller road that veered off, hoping to break away from the mysterious car. But just as I tried, I saw it. The sedan's headlights swerved to match mine, making the turn in perfect synchronization. Now, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. My hands were trembling. The thought of being followed by someone who didn't make a sound, who didn't seem to be accelerating or decelerating like a normal car, sent chills down my spine. The silence was suffocating. There was no sound of tires on the asphalt, no engine noise, no wind blowing through the trees. It was like driving in a vacuum. I needed to get out of there. I floored the gas pedal, speeding down the road in a desperate bid to escape. The car behind me stayed with me, its headlights shining steadily in my rearview mirror, always right on my tail. The distance between us never changed. I checked my speedometer, 90 miles per hour, but the car behind me was still there, as if I were driving at a crawl. Then, as suddenly as it started, the car behind me vanished. I looked back, expecting to see the sedan still tailing me, but there was nothing. The road behind me was completely empty. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might explode. My mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. I had been certain that I was being followed, but now, there was nothing. I slowed down, breathing heavily as I tried to collect myself. The tension in my body slowly started to ease, but a gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach remained. I glanced in my side mirror again. Nothing. The road was completely clear. I eventually made it home, but that night I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the car, it was the utter silence. The way it had followed me without a sound. The way it had matched my every move, like it was somehow aware of what I was going to do before I did it. I haven't driven that stretch of road since. And every time I pass through that area, I can't help but wonder if I'm still being watched, still being followed by that silent car, lurking just out of sight. But every time I glance in my rearview mirror, there's nothing there. I had just finished an exhausting week of work and decided to take a much-needed break. To clear my head, I planned a short solo drive through the countryside. It was a quiet Saturday morning with the sky overcast but not too gloomy. The air had that crisp, refreshing feel to it, and the thought of getting away from the usual hustle and bustle sounded perfect. I drove my old sedan down a narrow, unmarked road I had discovered a few weeks ago on a previous drive. It was a winding path through dense woods, the kind of road that seemed to disappear into the trees as if no one had maintained it in years. I was used to the isolation. I liked it, actually. It gave me time to think. As I made my way down the road, I noticed a faint sign on a small post, barely visible among the overgrown branches. It said, "Tunnel, 1 mile." I had no idea there was a tunnel here. I had driven this route several times but never noticed it before. Curious, I pressed on, my curiosity outweighing any sense of caution. The further I drove, the more isolated the road became. The trees grew thicker on either side, their branches nearly arching over the car. The faint murmur of traffic and distant sounds of civilization slowly faded, leaving only the sound of my tires crunching over the gravel. And then I saw it. The tunnel. It was completely hidden from view until you were right on top of it. The entrance was carved into the rock, dark and yawning, like an open mouth ready to swallow you whole. The tunnel was narrow but tall enough for a car to pass through. I stopped for a moment, staring at it. It was strange. The tunnel looked ancient, weathered, and forgotten, but also oddly inviting. I wasn't afraid. Maybe it was the allure of something so secluded and untouched, or maybe I was just tired of the usual roads. Either way, I decided to drive through. I started my engine and drove forward, my headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. The tunnel was lined with uneven stone, its damp walls reflecting the light as I moved further inside. The air inside was cool, thick with a strange scent, like old earth and decay. As I drove deeper, a sense of isolation settled over me, more intense than before. It wasn't just the absence of other cars, it was something about the tunnel itself. The way it felt like it had been there for centuries, unnoticed, a place forgotten by time. I reached the halfway point when I noticed something. The tunnel wasn't as straight as it seemed at first. It bent slightly to the right, and for the first time, I felt a brief moment of hesitation. The faintest sound echoed through the walls, almost like a whisper. I looked around, trying to make sense of it, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. I kept driving. But then something else happened. The temperature dropped sharply, and my breath became visible in the air. It wasn't just cold, it felt wrong. The car's engine seemed to struggle a little, as though it were fighting against something unseen. I checked my dashboard, but everything seemed fine. The tunnel stretched ahead, pitch dark beyond my headlights. No other cars had passed through, and I was completely alone. I pressed on, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. But as I neared the end of the tunnel, something changed. A strange, soft thud sounded beneath the car, like something heavy had been dropped. I braked instinctively, my heart pounding, but the car didn't stop. It kept moving as though it had been pushed forward. I slammed on the brakes again, and this time the car came to a screeching halt. I sat there, hands trembling on the steering wheel. The noise had stopped. The engine was running smoothly again, but the atmosphere in the tunnel had shifted. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if something unseen was pressing in on me. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a bad patch of road or a tire issue, but my gut told me otherwise. I glanced in my rearview mirror. The tunnel was empty behind me, the faint light from the entrance growing smaller as I sat there, frozen. I should have turned around, but for some reason I couldn't. It was as if something was keeping me there, holding me in place. That's when I saw it. A shadow flickered on the wall of the tunnel, moving in time with the rhythm of my breath. I blinked, thinking it was just a trick of the light. But then it moved again. This time it wasn't a shadow. It was a figure, tall and thin, standing just outside the reach of my headlights, almost as if it was watching me. The figure didn't move, but it was unmistakable. It was humanoid, but distorted, its shape wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I quickly shifted the car into reverse and floored the gas pedal. My tires screamed against the gravel, but the car wouldn't budge. It felt like I was stuck, as if the tunnel was holding me in place. The figure didn't move, but I felt its presence pressing closer, growing more suffocating. With a sudden, jarring lurch, the car broke free. I slammed the gearshift back into drive and sped toward the exit, my hands shaking so violently that I could barely grip the wheel. I could hear the whisper again, faint but undeniable, echoing through the walls of the tunnel. It felt like the tunnel itself was alive, like it didn't want me to leave. I reached the mouth of the tunnel, and as I emerged into the daylight, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The tunnel was gone. There was nothing but an empty stretch of road behind me. No entrance, no rocks, no sign of the tunnel that had felt so real just moments ago. I slammed on the brakes and turned around, trying to retrace my steps, but there was nothing, just trees. The road continued, but the tunnel had vanished. I drove home in a daze, unable to shake the feeling that I had crossed some invisible line, seen something I wasn't supposed to see. The whisper in the tunnel still echoes in my mind like a warning, a promise, or perhaps a threat. I've never driven down that road again, and every time I pass that spot, I feel an icy chill in the air, like something is still waiting for me in the shadows, ready to pull me back. It was well past midnight when I found myself on a long stretch of highway, the dark road ahead of me lit only by the occasional streetlight. I had been driving for hours, heading back home after a business trip that had stretched longer than I had anticipated. Exhausted, I began looking for a place to stop and rest, but most of the motels along this route were either closed for the night or too far off the main highway. As I kept driving, I noticed a truck stop in the distance, dimly lit, with a few trucks parked outside, their drivers presumably taking a break. It looked like the only viable place to stop for the night. With no other options in sight, I pulled off the highway and into the gravel parking lot. The truck stop was small but functional, with a diner that had its lights on and a few weary truckers sitting inside. I parked near the diner and made my way to the entrance. The bell above the door jingled softly as I stepped inside, greeted by the familiar hum of a neon light and the scent of stale coffee. The diner wasn't exactly busy, but there were a few patrons at the counter, each lost in their own world. I ordered a coffee to keep myself awake for the last leg of my journey. As I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this place felt off. It was quiet, too quiet for a truck stop at this hour. The sound of the truck engines idling outside was muffled by the walls, and the diner itself felt strangely abandoned, despite the few truckers inside. After a few minutes, the man sitting at the counter across from me caught my eye. He looked disheveled, wearing a worn-out leather jacket, with a scruffy beard and a heavy sigh that seemed to mark the end of his patience with whatever was going on in his life. He glanced over at me and then back to his coffee, but there was something in his eyes, something unsettling. I wasn't sure if it was just the fatigue or if he was truly staring at me, but it made me feel uneasy. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. The longer I sat there, the more I noticed small details that seemed out of place. The truckers all seemed to be in their own world, yet their body language was off. They were twitching, constantly glancing toward the door, checking their watches, tapping their feet nervously. One of the truckers looked at the clock and muttered something to himself, as if it was almost time for something to happen. At that moment, a man entered the diner. He was tall, wearing a faded red baseball cap and a thick, unkempt beard. He didn't look like a trucker, and he certainly didn't look like someone who would belong in this small, dimly lit stop. He glanced around the diner with an air of quiet familiarity, as if he had been there many times before. He walked straight to the counter and sat down next to the man who had been staring at me earlier. There was something about the way the two of them interacted that caught my attention. The man in the baseball cap slid a small, crumpled envelope across the counter, which the scruffy trucker quickly pocketed without even looking at it. They exchanged a few whispered words, and the man in the cap stood up to leave, nodding silently at the other truckers. That's when I felt it. The air seemed to grow heavier, colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The truckers, who had been restless and fidgeting before, now became unnervingly still. There was a moment of tense silence, as if everyone in the diner was waiting for something. The man in the baseball cap left, his boots clicking against the floor as he disappeared into the night. I watched him go, but my gaze was drawn back to the truckers. The man sitting across from me, the one who had been staring at me, was suddenly much closer than he had been before. He leaned in, his breath sour and heavy, and whispered in a hoarse voice, "Get out of here. It's not safe for you." I felt my heart race, a wave of adrenaline washing over me as my instincts screamed at me to leave. I didn't ask any questions. I stood up and made my way to the door, but just as my hand reached for the handle, I heard a noise from outside. A truck engine revving up. A heavy diesel growl that echoed across the parking lot, followed by the sound of tires screeching against the gravel. Something wasn't right. I turned back, but the truckers weren't looking at me anymore. They were all staring out the window, watching something outside. I followed their gaze. A large, black semi-truck was speeding down the access road, its headlights cutting through the night, heading straight for the diner. It was going way too fast, and I could hear the engine growling louder as it got closer, almost as if it were deliberately trying to intimidate someone. I froze. The truck veered off the road at the last second, missing the diner by mere inches, and screeched to a halt at the edge of the parking lot. The air was thick with tension, and my gut told me something was horribly wrong. In a split second, everything seemed to happen at once. The truckers bolted from their seats, rushing toward the back door, their faces frantic, but they were too late. The truck's engine roared again, and just as I was about to make a run for it, I saw the man in the baseball cap reappear from the shadows, standing in front of the truck, blocking its path. The trucker from across the counter who had warned me stood in place, staring at me, his eyes wide and panicked as if urging me to leave. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I grabbed my keys and ran out into the night, jumping into my car, my heart pounding in my chest. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the diner, dark and still as if nothing had ever happened. I never stopped at that truck stop again, and to this day I don't know what I witnessed that night. But the feeling I had, the overwhelming sense that I had stumbled into something dangerous, something meant to stay hidden, has never left me. It was nearing 2 a.m. when I noticed the gas station. I had been driving for hours through the endless stretch of empty highway, the only companion being the hum of the tires against the road. My tank was running low, and I hadn't passed any gas stations in what felt like forever. I was about to turn off to a side road, hoping to find something soon, when I saw a flickering sign in the distance. Gas station, open 24 hours. I sighed in relief and decided to pull off. The station seemed small, nestled at the intersection of two lonely roads, its lights buzzing with an unsettling flicker. Despite the odd, out-of-place feeling, I needed fuel, and there were no other options. I pulled up to one of the pumps, turned off my car, and stepped out. The air was unusually still, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled into an abandoned place. The gas station was old, its exterior peeling, the windows cracked. There was a sense of neglect that made me uncomfortable, but I told myself it was just a rural stop, left to decay over time. I was the only one there, no other cars in sight. The bell above the door jingled as I walked inside, and I was met with a faint smell of stale coffee and something more unpleasant, like mold. The interior was dimly lit, with old posters on the walls promoting products I hadn't seen in years. There was a counter with an older man standing behind it, his face partially obscured by the shadows. He didn't greet me, but I didn't think much of it. It was late after all. I walked up to the counter and he looked up, his eyes tired and distant. His voice was gruff as he asked, "What can I do for you?" I didn't need much, just a quick fill-up, and I handed him my card. As he started processing the transaction, I glanced around, noticing how quiet the place was. There were no other customers, no sound of any machinery, nothing but the occasional flicker of the overhead lights. It almost felt like I had entered a different time, an era long past. Then I heard a noise. At first, I thought it was the creaking of the building, but then I realized it was coming from outside, faint but unmistakable, like the sound of someone walking through the gravel near the pumps. I froze, straining to hear. The noise grew louder, closer. I turned back to the man behind the counter. "Is there someone else here?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The man didn't respond right away, instead slowly scanning the room as if checking for something. Then he said, "No, just you and me tonight." His voice was low, almost like a whisper. I looked back out the window, but I couldn't see anyone. Still, the sound continued. Footsteps. Someone walking around my car. My heart started to race and I tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was another customer, someone who had parked out of sight. I forced myself to focus on the man at the counter, finishing the transaction as quickly as possible. "Okay, all set," he said without much enthusiasm, handing me my receipt. I nodded and turned to leave, but just as I reached the door, I heard the sound again, this time louder. Someone was definitely out there. I hesitated, my hand on the door handle. What if I was being followed? What if someone was planning something? The feeling of being watched crept over me. My instinct screamed to get back in my car and leave, but I couldn't ignore the fear that something wasn't right. I pushed open the door and stepped outside. The air was cold, the sky darkened with clouds, and the silence of the night felt heavier now. I looked around but didn't see anyone. The footsteps had stopped. I was about to turn back when I heard a soft voice, a whisper, from behind me just close enough to make me jump. "Leave now." I spun around but no one was there. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the parking lot. Still no sign of anyone. The only thing I could see was my car and the dimly lit gas station in the distance. That's when I noticed something even more unsettling. The old man who had been behind the counter was now standing at the door, watching me. He didn't move, just stared at me with those tired, lifeless eyes. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran back to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The sound of my breath seemed too loud in the silence. I slammed the door shut and started the engine, speeding away before I could think twice. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the gas station was already out of sight. The feeling of unease stayed with me for the rest of the drive, and I couldn't shake the voice I had heard. "Leave now." It echoed in my head, and I kept wondering who had been there with me and why they had told me to leave. I never found out, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never stop at that gas station again. It was late in the evening when I took a wrong turn on my way to a friend's house. I had been driving down a road I didn't recognize for a while, convinced I was still heading in the right direction. The streets were darker here, the buildings more spaced out, and the occasional flicker of street lights gave the place an eerie, forgotten feel. I hadn't realized just how far off the main road I had strayed until the familiar landmarks disappeared entirely. I kept driving, hoping to find a turnoff or some indication of civilization ahead, but instead I found myself at the entrance to an old, industrial-looking area, an empty stretch of road lined with rundown warehouses. Most of the buildings were abandoned, their windows broken, and their once bright paint faded into dull, grimy surfaces. The place looked like it hadn't seen human activity in years. My phone had no signal, and the GPS was useless, spinning endlessly as it tried to locate me in this isolated area. It was getting late, and I had no choice but to turn around and retrace my steps. I tried to pull a U-turn, but as I did, my headlights caught a strange sight. One of the warehouse doors was slightly ajar, enough to suggest it had been opened recently. My curiosity got the better of me. I parked my car and stepped out into the chilly air. The ground beneath my feet was covered in gravel and dirt, and I felt a subtle unease creep over me as I approached the warehouse. The door was cracked open just enough for me to slip inside. I hesitated for a moment, but with my phone still out of service, I decided it would be best to check the inside in case there was anyone who could help me get back on track. The warehouse smelled of rust, mold, and old machinery. The floor was littered with broken crates, discarded tools, and what appeared to be old office furniture. The place was a maze of forgotten junk, and I couldn't help but feel like I was stepping into a ghostly relic of some past industrial boom. I moved cautiously, every footstep echoing off the concrete walls. As I walked deeper into the warehouse, I noticed a faint noise in the distance. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, almost like tapping, like someone was knocking on metal. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart pounding in my chest. The sound stopped as soon as I did, leaving only silence behind. I tried to reason with myself that it was just the wind, the building settling, but my gut told me something was off. I turned around and started to head back toward the door, but before I could take more than a few steps, I heard it again, the tapping louder this time, closer. It wasn't the wind, and it certainly wasn't the building settling. It was deliberate, methodical, like someone was trying to get my attention. My eyes scanned the darkness, and that's when I saw movement, a shadow flitting across the far side of the warehouse. It was too quick to make out clearly, but it was definitely a person. Panic surged through me. I wasn't alone. I froze, listening intently. The tapping continued, growing more frantic, more urgent. I took a few steps toward the noise, trying to keep my breathing steady. The air was thick with the smell of dampness and decay. The noise stopped as I neared a row of large, rusted containers stacked against the wall. I peered around them carefully, my heart racing in my chest. Then I saw him. A man, hunched over, dressed in ragged clothes, his back turned to me as he methodically tapped on a rusted piece of machinery with a metal rod. His movements were slow but deliberate. His clothes were torn and his skin was pale, almost sickly looking. But what really disturbed me was the way he didn't seem to notice my presence. He was so absorbed in his task, like he was trapped in some routine, isolated from the world. I couldn't stay there. I turned quickly, my mind screaming at me to leave, but just as I started to retreat, I heard a loud crash, something falling to the floor behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. The tapping had stopped. That's when I heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate, from the direction I had just come. Someone was following me. I didn't wait to see who it was. My instincts took over and I bolted for the door. My heart was racing in my chest as I sprinted toward the exit. The air felt colder and the building seemed to close in on me as I ran. I could hear the footsteps getting closer, but I dared not look back. When I reached the door, I tried to yank it open, but it stuck. Panic surged through me as I struggled to pry it open. Just as I felt a hand grip my shoulder, I managed to force the door free, stumbling out into the cold night air. I didn't stop to look behind me as I ran to my car, jumped in, and sped off, not stopping until I reached the main road. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, but there was no sign of anyone. No one had followed me out of the warehouse. Still, the eerie feeling lingered. What had I just encountered? The man with the rod? The shadow I had seen? I couldn't shake the thought that I had narrowly avoided something dangerous, but I would never know for sure. I haven't driven down that road since, and I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the tapping that echoed through the dark warehouse, and the eerie stillness that hung over everything. Something about that place felt wrong, unnervingly wrong, and I'll always wonder who or what was waiting in that abandoned warehouse that night. It was an impulsive decision. I had driven for hours, craving solitude, and with no real destination in mind, I found myself turning down a narrow, winding road that led to a secluded stretch of coastline. My phone had no signal, the sun was beginning to set, and the air had a salty, almost metallic scent to it, like a storm was brewing. I wasn't expecting to find much. This area was far removed from the tourist traps, a part of the coast that felt forgotten by most. After a few more twists and turns, I came across a weathered wooden sign that simply read, "Beach House for Rent." Curious, I pulled over, scanning the area. The house wasn't far off the road, and I could see its silhouette against the darkening sky. It looked like something straight out of an old postcard, rustic, cozy, and charming in a way that made it seem inviting, even though it was clearly a little rundown. It was cheap. Too cheap, in fact. After checking around for any other options, I figured I could at least stay the night, get some rest before heading back to civilization. The house, though, was eerily quiet. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, the smell of stale air and damp wood hitting me immediately. Dust covered every surface, the furniture looked old, and a few windows had been boarded up. But it had a certain charm, an almost nostalgic feel to it. As I explored, I noticed the house wasn't as neglected as it appeared from the outside. There was a well-stocked kitchen, a working bathroom, and a comfy-looking bed. I felt a slight chill as I walked through the living room, though. The windows were all closed, yet the air felt wrong, too still. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and decided to go for a walk along the beach while I still had some daylight left. As I stepped out onto the sand, the wind had picked up, and the distant rumble of thunder could be heard over the crashing waves. The beach was deserted, not a soul in sight. But something about the place felt unsettling, like I was being watched from afar. I couldn't shake the feeling, and I quickly returned to the house, hoping the storm would blow over. By the time I was back inside, the storm was picking up, the wind howling through the cracks in the walls. I tried to distract myself with a book, but the constant creaking of the house, coupled with the distant sound of something scraping, kept pulling my attention away. It was almost as if there were footsteps in the attic, or maybe even something moving on the roof. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the house settling in the wind. But then I heard it again, a loud thump, followed by a dragging sound that seemed to come from the floor above. My blood ran cold. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. I waited for a few seconds, hoping the sound would stop. But it didn't. I couldn't stay in the living room any longer. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but I had nowhere to go, and the storm was too intense for me to risk driving through it. So I slowly ascended the stairs to the second floor, my footsteps slow and deliberate. The house felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in around me with every step I took. I reached the top of the stairs and the sound stopped. I hesitated for a moment, my breath shallow. The hallway was dim, lit only by a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The door to the attic was slightly ajar, a dark, empty space beyond it. As I approached, the unmistakable scraping sound started again, this time from within the attic. I stood frozen for a moment, fighting the urge to turn and run. But something kept me rooted in place. Slowly, I pushed the door open, heart pounding, and peered inside. The attic was dark, filled with old boxes and old furniture covered in sheets. The air was thick, musty with the smell of decay. As I stepped inside, the scraping sound seemed to come from above me, as if something, or someone, was moving around in the rafters. My mind raced, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Then I saw it, a dark figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw the figure move. It was tall, thin, and wearing ragged clothing. The figure seemed to shuffle back and forth, dragging something heavy behind it. My heart stopped, and I quickly backed out of the attic, slamming the door shut behind me. I heard the scraping stop, followed by an eerie silence. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, too scared to move, too terrified to even call for help. My phone still had no signal, and the storm outside was so loud that I doubted anyone would hear me even if I screamed. I didn't know what to do. Should I leave? Was I imagining it? I turned toward the stairs, ready to grab my things and get out of the house. But as I took the first step, I heard a soft, guttural voice. Leave? The voice was faint, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I froze, staring down the stairs into the darkness below. There was no way I was staying another minute. I ran down the stairs, grabbed my bag, and rushed out the front door. The storm was in full force now, the rain coming down in sheets, but I didn't care. I didn't even bother with my car. I just ran toward the beach, knowing I couldn't stay there for another second. I never went back to that house. To this day, I still don't know who or what I heard in that attic, but the sound of that scraping, the low voice warning me to leave, still haunts me. And the strangest part? The next morning, when I drove past the house on my way out, it was completely gone, as though it had never been there at all. I was looking for a quiet weekend away from the city, a chance to disconnect, clear my head, and enjoy the peace of nature. I had booked a small cabin in the woods by a remote lake, somewhere deep in the forest where the only noise was supposed to be the wind rustling through the trees. It sounded perfect. The pictures from the rental listing had promised a rustic, cozy retreat. The only problem was I hadn't checked the weather forecast. I drove for hours to get to the cabin. The road was narrow and winding, surrounded by thick trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. As I neared the cabin, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. The air had turned humid, and I could feel a storm brewing in the distance. When I arrived, the cabin looked exactly like the photos, small, wooden, and charming. It was nestled on a hill overlooking the lake, surrounded by dense forest. The perfect place for some peace and solitude. I unloaded my bags and went inside, immediately feeling the warmth of the rustic interior. The crackling fireplace added to the cozy atmosphere, making it hard to ignore the growing sense of excitement. But as I unpacked and settled in, I couldn't help but notice the sky growing darker. The clouds had gathered quickly, turning the once clear blue sky into a mass of threatening gray. The wind picked up, rattling the trees. It was going to rain. I thought nothing of it, as storms in the woods weren't unusual, but then it started to pour hard and fast. The rain hammered against the cabin's roof and windows, and the sound of the wind howling outside grew more intense by the minute. As the storm raged on, I settled into the living room with a book. But soon I heard something that made me stop reading. A faint, distant sound. A rush of water like a stream running too fast. I thought it was just the heavy rain, but it didn't sound right. I went to the window and looked out at the lake. The water level had risen considerably, now almost spilling over the banks. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the lake seemed to be swelling, creeping toward the trees. I went to check the cabin's exterior. The ground around the cabin was already wet, and the water was slowly edging closer. My stomach dropped as I realized the situation was worse than I initially thought. The small hill the cabin sat on was the only thing keeping the rising water from flooding the ground floor. I quickly called the cabin owner, but the call wouldn't go through. The storm had knocked out the signal. With no way to contact anyone, I went inside and began gathering my things ready to leave, but the rain only intensified. It was as if the sky itself was opening up. I knew that if I didn't leave soon, I'd be trapped. I tried to open the cabin door, but it wouldn't budge. The wind was so fierce now that it slammed against the walls, and I could hear the sound of branches snapping in the forest. Water began seeping in through the cracks in the door frame and windows, slowly rising inside the cabin. I grabbed my shoes and ran to the back of the house, hoping there was a way to get out from there. As I stepped outside, the situation had grown even worse. The water around the cabin had reached the edge of the hill, and the forest surrounding me had become a flooded marsh. I could barely see anything through the heavy rain, but I knew I had to find higher ground. My only choice was to head toward a small road I had passed earlier, hoping it was not submerged. I started running, my shoes sinking into the muddy ground with each step. The rain pelted me and the wind felt like it might knock me over. I could see nothing but water and trees, the sound of the storm deafening. As I reached the road, I stopped for a moment to catch my breath. The road had turned into a river with water rushing past, cutting off any hope of getting out. Suddenly, I heard something behind me, a movement in the trees. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a branch breaking, but then the movement became more distinct. Someone, or something, was walking through the water. I froze, straining my eyes in the heavy rain, but I couldn't make out the figure clearly. The only thing I could see were shadows moving closer, the distorted outline of a person trudging through the floodwater toward me. My heart started racing. There was no one else around for miles. Who could be out here in the storm? Panic set in as the figure grew closer. I could see that it was a person now, but there was something wrong about the way they moved, slow, deliberate, as if they were dragging something behind them. I backed away, stumbling through the water, my mind racing with dread. Just as the figure reached the edge of the road, I heard something strange, a low, guttural sound like something being dragged through the mud. It didn't sound human. The figure took one more step, and then, in a horrifying flash of lightning, I saw it clearly. The person's face was obscured by something dark, and their hands were gripping a large, bulky object that was trailing behind them, creating the dragging sound. I couldn't tell if it was a person, a bag, or something else entirely, but I didn't want to find out. In a panic, I turned and ran down the road, my feet slipping on the wet pavement as I tried to get away from whatever it was. The figure didn't chase me, just stood there watching me. I didn't stop running until I reached a small bridge about a mile away, the water just beginning to rise around the edges. I collapsed, breathless and terrified, realizing just how close I had come to whatever that thing in the flood had been. I never returned to that cabin, and I still don't know who or what I saw in the storm. But I'll never forget the face or the sound of something being dragged through the water. The storm had drowned the landscape, but it also drowned whatever happened that night in that flood, leaving only a haunting memory of something I couldn't explain. I had always been fond of long drives, especially when I needed time to think. So, when a work project fell through and I found myself with a few days off, I decided to take a solo trip to clear my mind. I had a vague plan in mind, no real destination, just an open road ahead. I took a route I'd never driven before, a stretch of highway that cut through miles of farmland and dense forest. I'd heard it was a scenic drive with little traffic and plenty of places to stop and explore. The road was narrow, winding through open fields, small towns, and patches of woods, with very few signs of life. No gas stations, no motels, just the occasional farmhouse far in the distance. The weather was perfect when I started, the kind of crisp autumn day where the air smells fresh and the sky is a cloudless blue. But as the day wore on, the sun began to dip lower, and a strange fog started to roll in, thick and fast. It came in quickly, swallowing the road in front of me, making the landscape blur into nothingness. At first, I didn't think much of it. Fog happens especially in the evenings. But this fog was unlike any I had encountered before. It was dense, almost suffocating. I could barely see more than a few feet ahead, and the headlights of my car seemed to do little more than push the thick mist further into my line of sight. I kept driving, hoping the fog would clear soon, but it didn't. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. The road ahead was nearly invisible, and the white knuckles on the steering wheel told me I was starting to feel uneasy. I passed a few small houses along the way, but the further I went, the less I saw. The fog seemed to isolate each structure, as if it were a barrier separating me from the rest of the world. The first sign that something was wrong came when I noticed a car ahead of me. It was a few hundred yards away, parked on the shoulder of the road with its hazard lights blinking. I was relieved at first, at least I wasn't alone. But as I got closer, something didn't seem right. The car was empty. The engine was still running and the lights were flashing, but there was no one inside. The doors were wide open, as if whoever had been driving had just stepped out and walked away without a care. I slowed down, trying to make sense of it, but a strange chill crept up my spine. I didn't see any footprints in the fog, nothing to suggest where the driver had gone. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to stop. But something about the scene felt off, and my instincts screamed at me to keep moving. So I drove past it, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror as I kept going. The fog thickened even more as I continued down the road. My headlights cut through the haze like a knife, but even they didn't seem to be enough. The trees and fields beside the road were just shadows in the fog, indistinct and eerie. There was a creeping sense of isolation setting in, the feeling of being completely cut off from the rest of the world. It was as if the fog itself was closing in, pushing me further into the unknown. I passed another house, this one dark and still. A lone light flickered in the window. The house looked abandoned, like it had been empty for years. But as I glanced at it, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the window, just for a split second. A tall, thin shape watching me. My breath caught in my throat. I looked back, but the figure was gone. I felt my pulse quicken, but I kept driving, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The fog was messing with my mind. A few miles later, I saw something else in the distance. It was a sign. A road sign that I hadn't noticed before. The letters on it were faded, hard to read in the dim light. I slowed down to see if I could make it out, but as I got closer, the sign seemed to blur and vanish as if the fog itself was swallowing it up. I was sure I had seen it clearly, but now it was as if the sign had never existed at all. A creeping unease settled in. I was starting to question my own perception of reality. How had I been driving for so long on this road without seeing any other cars, people, or signs of life? Had I missed something, or had the world around me simply vanished? I was starting to feel trapped in the fog, isolated from everything. I rolled down the window, hoping the fresh air might snap me out of it. But as soon as I did, I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the engine and the wind. It was a whisper. A voice, barely more than a breath, coming from somewhere in the fog. Stop. My heart skipped a beat and I slammed the window back up, heart racing. The voice had sounded so real, so close. But when I glanced around, there was no one, nothing but fog and trees. I kept driving, faster now, hoping to get out of whatever nightmare I was in. But the road stretched on, the fog never clearing and the whispering never stopping. Every few minutes, the voice would return, always the same, always in the same soft, haunting tone. Stop. I didn't know how long I had been driving, but the exhaustion was setting in. I felt as though I had been on that road for hours, days even. My mind was starting to unravel, my thoughts scattering in the thick mist around me. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I saw a light in the distance. A street light, or perhaps a porch light from a nearby house. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of the fog, to see something other than the gray, oppressive walls surrounding me. But as I neared the light, something stopped me dead in my tracks. It wasn't a house. It wasn't a street light. It was a sign just like the one I had seen earlier, and it was the same one that had vanished. It had reappeared, this time right in front of me, blocking the road. And written on it, in faded letters, were the words, "Turn back." I didn't stop to think. I didn't even blink. I spun the car around, gunning the engine, driving as fast as I could in the opposite direction. The fog seemed to push against me as though it were trying to pull me back, but I didn't stop until I reached a familiar stretch of road, the fog slowly dissipating with every mile. I never found that road again. I've looked for it countless times since, but no matter where I drive, I can't find the turn-off. That fog, that voice, those signs, it's as if the road never existed in the first place. And yet, every so often, I hear that voice in my mind whispering, "Stop." I've always been an avid camper. The idea of getting away from the noise of the city, pitching a tent in the wilderness, and spending a night under the stars has always been my idea of a perfect retreat. So when I found an isolated campsite deep in the forest on a trip to the mountains, I was more than excited. It was far from any main road or trail, and the booking website even mentioned that the place was untouched by civilization. That's exactly what I wanted. I drove for hours deeper into the mountains until I found the narrow dirt path that led to the campsite. The road had been barely used, overgrown with thick brush, but the website promised it would be worth the effort. The air was crisp and the sun was setting low behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the forest. I couldn't wait to get there. When I arrived, the campsite was exactly as promised. Secluded, surrounded by tall trees and a slow-moving creek nearby. There was a fire pit, a few logs for sitting, and a small wooden structure that looked like a shed, meant to store firewood and other camping supplies. It was perfect. I quickly set up my tent, making sure to carefully secure the guy ropes against the wind that had started picking up. By the time I had everything in place, the sky was darkening, and the first stars were starting to emerge. I made a fire and sat by it, watching the flames flicker. The sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, the occasional bird call, and the soft rush of the creek created a calming atmosphere. There was no one around for miles, just me and nature. But as the night wore on, that sense of isolation began to feel more like loneliness, and a strange unease started to creep in. I chalked it up to being alone in a place so far removed from civilization. The silence had become almost oppressive, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I tried to shake it off and settled deeper into my camp chair, staring into the fire. The shadows danced across the trees, the crackling of the logs occasionally breaking the stillness. Then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard something faint. At first, it sounded like the rustling of leaves, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate to be the wind. I looked around, but I could see nothing in the darkness. The moonlight barely broke through the canopy of trees, and the firelight barely reached beyond the clearing. My heart skipped a beat, but I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon scavenging nearby. But the sound didn't go away. It continued, getting louder, closer. The soft crunch of something moving through the underbrush. Footsteps. Human footsteps. I froze. Who else could be out here? The campsite was remote, and the only way to access it was by the dirt path I had taken. I hadn't seen any other vehicles when I arrived, and the nearest road was miles away. I quickly got up and grabbed the flashlight I had left by the fire, shining it in the direction of the noise. For a few moments, nothing. Then I saw it. A figure, tall, cloaked in darkness, moving silently through the trees at the edge of the clearing. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a person, walking at a deliberate pace, heading toward the camp. My mind raced. Should I call out? Should I hide? The figure didn't seem to notice the light from my flashlight as it continued its slow advance. I felt a chill run down my spine, and every survival instinct told me to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the ground. The figure stopped. It stood still for a moment, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, it turned and vanished into the trees. I waited, breath held, for several minutes. There was no sound now, just the crackling of the fire and the rustling of the wind in the branches. Was I imagining things? I couldn't be sure. I tried to convince myself that it was just a hiker or someone else looking for the same secluded spot. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. The unease settled in my gut like a cold stone, and I couldn't shake the thought that I wasn't alone. I spent the rest of the night near the fire, listening for any more sounds. The forest, which had been so peaceful before, now seemed alive with hidden movement. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent my heart racing, but nothing else happened. The night dragged on, and eventually, I fell into an uneasy sleep, the sound of the creek providing the only comfort. The next morning, I was eager to pack up and leave. I checked my phone. No signal, of course, out here in the wilderness. As I started to pack my tent, I walked toward the small shed near the campfire to retrieve some of my gear. As I opened the door, I froze. Inside, the space was small, mostly empty except for a few tools and some firewood. But on the far corner of the shed, I noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints in the dirt, leading to a pile of logs, but no one had been there when I arrived the night before. The prints were too distinct to be an animal's. They were the unmistakable marks of human feet. The kind of print you'd leave if you had been standing there recently. I rushed out of the shed, my heart pounding. Had someone been in my camp last night while I slept? It didn't make sense. There was no sign of anyone when I arrived. But now the footprints suggested otherwise. I grabbed my things and, without a second thought, packed up faster than I ever had before. I wanted to leave. The fog that had rolled in during the night was now beginning to clear, but the unease lingered. Every rustle in the trees felt like someone was watching me, following me. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the clearing watching me leave. But there was nothing. Just the empty, quiet forest. I haven't been camping since. Every time I close my eyes, I can still hear the footsteps in the night, and I wonder if the figure ever left, or if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to camp on that isolated patch of land. It was supposed to be a peaceful hiking trip, just me and the mountain. The plan was simple: spend a couple of days in the wilderness, disconnect from the hustle and bustle of everyday life, and enjoy the quiet of the forest. I had been looking forward to this hike for weeks, knowing that it would give me the chance to clear my head and recharge. The weather was perfect when I set out, sunny with a light breeze rustling through the trees. The trail I was following was well marked, and the sounds of birds chirping made it feel like I was in my own personal paradise. As the hours passed, the trail began to wind higher into the hills, and the forest grew denser. The trees became more imposing, casting long shadows across the path, but I didn't think much of it. I was used to the woods. I'd done solo hikes before, and while the isolation sometimes felt eerie, it was part of the experience. I pushed forward, my pack strapped tightly to my back, and I relished the solitude. But the serenity didn't last long. It started with a subtle sense of discomfort, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The air grew cooler, and the wind began to pick up, stirring the branches above me in a way that felt unnervingly unnatural. I stopped for a moment to rest and take a drink from my water bottle, but as I stood there, I noticed something strange. A set of fresh footprints in the mud near the base of the trail. They didn't look like animal tracks. They were too large, too deliberate. And there was something odd about their shape, like whoever had left them was walking in an unnatural gait. My first instinct was to brush it off. Maybe it was just someone else on the trail. But as I continued walking, I found more of the footprints. They seemed to be heading in the same direction as mine. At first, I thought it was nothing, maybe the wind playing tricks on my mind. But as I walked deeper into the forest, a creeping feeling began to settle in. I wasn't alone. The forest grew darker as the sun dipped lower behind the trees. I should have turned back then, but I was stubborn, convinced that I could make it to the summit before nightfall. The wind howled louder now, and the temperature dropped sharply. The only sounds were my footsteps crunching against the forest floor and the occasional rustling of the leaves. I looked around constantly, feeling eyes on me, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. That's when I heard it. The snap. A twig breaking, followed by another, and then a low grunt that sounded far too human. My heart raced, my breath shallow. I froze, listening, straining to hear any other noises. For a long moment there was nothing. Just the wind, the trees, and my own racing heartbeat. I began walking faster, my mind filled with paranoid thoughts. Who could be out here with me? Why hadn't I seen them? The trail was narrow and the trees were thick, making it impossible to see far ahead. I checked my phone for a signal. Nothing. Just a blank screen. I was truly alone now. I quickened my pace, determined to reach the top and find shelter before darkness fell completely. But as the trail twisted and turned, the unease in my stomach grew. The footprints were everywhere now, and they seemed to be following me. I thought about turning back, but the idea of retracing my steps in the growing darkness filled me with dread. Then I heard the voices, low, muttering voices carried by the wind. They were unintelligible, almost like a chant. Panic surged through me, and I looked around wildly, my eyes scanning the trees. I was certain someone was there, watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I couldn't take it anymore. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my hands were trembling as I grabbed my flashlight and tried to force myself to think logically. There had to be a rational explanation. But then I heard it, a rustling in the bushes, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone stepping through the undergrowth. I turned and ran. The trail was uneven, and my feet stumbled over rocks and roots as I pushed myself harder, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness in frantic sweeps. My breaths came in ragged gasps, and every few steps, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone there. But there was nothing. Only the oppressive silence of the forest and the pounding of my own heart. I ran for what felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. I had no idea where I was anymore, the trail long gone, the forest swallowing me whole. Then, in the distance, I saw a light, a flickering yellow light through the trees. Hope surged in my chest. I wasn't imagining things. Someone else had to be out there. I ran toward the light, adrenaline making my legs move faster. As I neared the source of the light, I stumbled into a clearing. In front of me was a small, old cabin, its windows lit from within. Relief flooded through me, and I stumbled forward, almost collapsing in front of the door. I knocked, and when no one answered, I tried the handle. To my surprise, it opened. Inside there was no one. The cabin was abandoned, its furniture covered in a thick layer of dust, and the air was musty. But it wasn't empty. Scattered across the floor were strange markings, scratched into the wood, like someone had tried to carve something into the floorboards. And in the corner of the room was a pile of torn clothing. I was too afraid to stay. I grabbed my backpack and ran back into the night, my feet barely touching the ground as I scrambled through the dark. I didn't stop until I reached the main road and flagged down a passing car. I never found out who or what was following me that day. I never returned to that mountain. But sometimes when I'm alone in the woods, I still feel the weight of those eyes on me. And I wonder if I'll ever truly be alone again. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. My friends and I had been planning this camping trip for months. Just the four of us, escaping the noise of the city to spend a few days in the mountains, far from the distractions of modern life. We arrived on Friday evening, the sun already setting as we set up our camp near a small, tranquil lake surrounded by towering pines. The air was crisp, and the sky had a calming lavender hue. It felt like the perfect escape. The first night passed without incident. We sat around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the trees. Everything felt right. But that peace would quickly unravel the next morning. I woke up early around dawn, to the sound of a faint rumbling in the distance. It wasn't the thunder of an approaching storm, but something else, low and constant, like the hum of a distant machine. I got up to investigate, waking up my friends as I ventured toward the source of the noise. It was then that I noticed something odd. In the middle of the forest, far off the main trail, I saw a structure I hadn't noticed the previous evening. A cabin. It was old and weathered, with peeling paint and a crooked chimney. It hadn't been there the night before, at least I didn't think so. I returned to camp to find that my friends were already packing up for a short hike to a nearby peak. I suggested that we check out the cabin, but they were uninterested, preferring to stick to the plan. Reluctantly, I decided to go alone. It was only a short walk, and I figured it might be interesting to explore this strange, seemingly forgotten building. The cabin wasn't far from our camp, just a few hundred yards deep into the trees. As I approached, a sense of unease crept over me. The air grew colder, the noise of the distant hum becoming more pronounced as I drew nearer. It was like the cabin was absorbing the surrounding light, casting long, unnatural shadows. The windows were dark and there was no sign of life. It looked abandoned, isolated, like it had been standing there for decades. I pushed open the door, which creaked loudly, revealing a dark, musty interior. The floor was covered in dust and cobwebs clung to the corners. There was nothing remarkable about the place, just old furniture covered in tarps, a fireplace choked with ash, and a few items scattered around. A broken chair, some rusted tools, and a half-empty glass jar filled with what looked like old nails. I wasn't sure why, but I felt a deep sense of foreboding. It was as though the place was holding its breath, waiting. Still, I convinced myself that it was just an old, abandoned cabin. Nothing more. I decided to explore the upstairs. The staircase was narrow, and the wood groaned under my weight as I ascended. At the top, I found two doors, one on the left and one on the right. The left door was slightly ajar, and I instinctively pushed it open. The room beyond was small, empty except for a few rotting floorboards and a single rusted lamp hanging from the ceiling. It smelled stale, like old paper and mildew. Then I noticed something strange, a small scrap of paper on the floor, partially obscured by the furniture. I bent down to pick it up. The note was written in faded ink, the handwriting rushed and jagged. "They're watching you. Don't trust the silence." My heart skipped a beat. Who had left this, and why? My first thought was that it was a prank, but the fear in the message felt too real, too urgent. I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out from behind the door. But there was nothing. Just the cold, empty room. I moved on to the next door, but this time something was different. The door was locked. And it wasn't just the kind of lock that could be opened with a simple twist of the knob. This was an old-fashioned padlock, rusted and worn. I could feel my pulse quicken. Who would lock a door in such a remote place? I was about to turn back when I heard something, soft footsteps like someone was moving on the floor above me. At first, I thought it was the wind or the house settling. But then the steps grew louder, more deliberate. Someone was up there. I froze. My mind raced. It was just me in the cabin, right? I had seen no one on my way up. The sound continued, followed by the faintest whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. Leave now. I don't know why I did it, but I ran. I bolted down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest, and rushed outside. The sunlight felt blinding after the dark interior of the cabin. I didn't stop until I was back at camp, out of breath and shaken to the core. When I told my friends, they thought I was exaggerating, or perhaps I had imagined the whole thing. But they agreed to pack up and leave early. As we walked back toward the car, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. It looked the same, old, decrepit, and empty. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. It wasn't until later that night, when we were back in the city, that I found out the real history of the cabin. A quick search online revealed something chilling. The cabin had been the site of an unsolved disappearance 20 years ago. A man had vanished without a trace while hiking in the area, and rumors swirled that the place was haunted by his ghost. The cabin, it seemed, had more than just a dark past. It held something else, a presence that lingered, waiting for the next person to wander too close. I've always loved hiking alone. There's something about the solitude, the quiet of the forest, that calms me. So when I decided to take a solo hiking trip through a remote mountain trail, I thought it would be the perfect way to clear my head. The trail was well known for its stunning views and the occasional wildlife sightings. I had done my research, packed everything I needed, and set off early one Saturday morning with the sun barely peeking over the horizon. The first few hours were peaceful, just the soft crunch of my boots on the dirt trail and the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees. The air was cool but not too cold, and I felt the kind of contentment you only get when you're away from everything, the stress of work, the noise of the city. But as the day wore on, something felt off. I couldn't quite place it at first, just a vague unease gnawing at the back of my mind. I kept checking my surroundings more often than I usually did. The path was still clear, but there was a noticeable lack of wildlife. No birds, no squirrels, no rustling in the underbrush. Just silence. Then, about 4 hours into my hike, I saw him. At first, I thought it was just another hiker. There was a man ahead, standing off to the side of the trail, partially obscured by a cluster of trees. He was wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap, with a backpack slung over his shoulder. I gave a friendly wave as I approached, but he didn't wave back. He simply stood there, staring at the ground. As I got closer, I noticed how still he was. He hadn't moved at all, even though I had been walking toward him for several minutes. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and my instinct was to keep walking, to pretend I hadn't seen him. But something made me stop. "Hey, you all right?" I called out, trying to sound casual. The man looked up slowly, his eyes locking onto mine. There was an unsettling emptiness to his gaze, like he wasn't really seeing me, just staring through me. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Yeah," he said, his voice flat and unconvincing. "Just looking at the view." He gestured vaguely toward the landscape, though there was nothing particularly special about it, just dense trees and rocks. I forced a smile. "Right. Well, enjoy the hike," I said, backing away. But as I started to walk past him, I heard his voice again, softer this time. "Do you hear it?" I stopped. The question hung in the air, unsettling in its simplicity. "What?" I asked, trying to ignore the growing discomfort in my chest. "The noise. They're coming," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I stared at him, unsure how to respond. His eyes were wide now, the expression on his face twisted in some mixture of fear and confusion. I thought he was probably just some guy who'd gotten lost or was struggling with his own thoughts. I didn't want to linger longer than necessary. "I think you should get down from here," I said, trying to sound calm. "It's getting late." Before I could turn to leave, I heard it, a faint rustling behind me just on the edge of my hearing. My heart skipped a beat and I turned to look, but there was nothing there. "I'm serious," the man said, stepping closer, his eyes wide now. "They'll find you. It's not safe here." I felt a wave of panic surge through me. My first instinct was to run, but I didn't want to seem like I was overreacting. I had to calm down. This was just some random guy. Maybe he was off his meds or something. I nodded, forcing a tight smile, and started walking faster, keeping my eyes on the trail ahead. But the unease didn't leave. The sense that something was wrong, that I was being watched, grew stronger with every step. I kept hearing noises, branches snapping, footsteps following mine, but whenever I turned around, there was no one. It was like the forest itself was closing in on me. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, I was starting to panic. The man's warning had planted a seed of fear in my mind, and now every sound in the woods felt like a threat. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid. But the closer I got to the end of the trail, the more certain I became that I wasn't alone. That's when I saw it. About a quarter of a mile from the trailhead, I noticed a figure up ahead, standing completely still in the middle of the path. My heart dropped into my stomach. It was him. The same man. He was standing perfectly still, just staring at me. I froze. My blood ran cold and I could feel my breath catch in my chest. There was no way this could be happening. I hadn't heard anyone else approach, and I certainly hadn't passed him earlier. He was just standing there waiting for me. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice low and hoarse. I turned and started running, adrenaline kicking in. My boots pounded against the dirt, my breathing ragged, my mind racing. The trail blurred before my eyes as I sprinted, fear clouding my every thought. I dared not look back. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead where a few cars were parked, and I burst into the parking lot, gasping for air. I glanced over my shoulder. There was no one behind me. The man was gone. It wasn't until I got home that I learned the truth. The hiking trail I had taken was known for the occasional disappearance, not of hikers, but of people who had been known to wander off the path and get lost in the woods. And there were rumors of someone or something that followed lone hikers, whispering to them, warning them. The man on the trail hadn't been a random stranger, I realized. He had been something, or someone, who had been waiting for me to come off course. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. But the warning stuck with me. They're coming. It had been one of those days. A long, exhausting drive across miles of highway with nothing but barren land stretching out in every direction. I had decided to take a shortcut through a rural back road to save time on my way to a remote cabin. The road was narrow and surrounded by empty fields with no signs of life, just the occasional car that quickly disappeared from view. The isolation felt comforting at first, but as I drove deeper into the countryside, things started to shift. My car suddenly sputtered and jolted, the engine giving a strange, uneven sound before going completely dead. I tried restarting it a few times, but nothing happened. The gas tank was half full, so it wasn't that. I opened the hood, hoping for a simple fix, maybe a loose wire or something obvious, but there was nothing. With no signal on my phone and no other options, I knew I had to walk. I hoped I could find someone, a house, a vehicle, anything that could help. The heat was relentless as I trudged down the dusty road, my footsteps creating the only sound in the otherwise silent expanse. It wasn't long before I saw the truck. It was an old, rusty pickup parked just off the road, a man standing next to it, leaning against the hood. He didn't seem to be doing anything, just watching the horizon. I assumed he might be another stranded motorist, so I made my way toward him. The closer I got, the more off he seemed. There was something unsettling about him. His clothes were worn and dirty, his face weathered, but it was more the stillness about him that unnerved me. He didn't greet me, didn't wave. He just stood there staring straight ahead. I hesitated but pressed on, figuring I had no other choice. Maybe he could point me in the direction of a town or even give me a ride. I walked closer, trying to keep my tone casual. But as I neared, I realized he hadn't moved at all. His eyes stayed fixed on the distance, not acknowledging my presence in any way. I felt the first prickle of unease crawl up my spine. The heat, the isolation, it all seemed to close in on me. Something about the situation wasn't right, but I couldn't figure out why. I stopped a few feet away from him, trying again to get his attention. When I spoke, his response was slow, deliberate. His words didn't quite make sense, almost as if he were reading from a script. He mentioned something about town being a long way off, in a tone that wasn't quite dismissive, but not helpful either. I wanted to leave, to walk away, but something held me there. I didn't trust him, but I couldn't put my finger on why. His posture was too rigid, his movements too controlled. I tried to read his face, but it was blank, void of any expression. Before I could say anything more, I heard a sound behind me, a faint rustling like someone walking through the brush. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned quickly, expecting to see someone else coming down the road. But there was nothing. Just the wind stirring the dry leaves and grass. I turned back to the man, my nerves on edge now. He hadn't moved, but his eyes were locked on me. The words that came next made my blood run cold. He said, "You shouldn't be out here alone." The way he said it, the calm certainty in his voice, sent a jolt of fear through me. I started to back away, but the man's gaze never wavered. He didn't say anything else, just stood there watching. The silence grew heavier, as if the world itself had stopped breathing. I wasn't sure what to do. I wasn't sure what I was afraid of, but something inside me screamed that I needed to get away, that I was in danger. I turned to walk back down the road, my steps quickening with every beat of my heart. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, behind me. I froze. They were close now, too close. I spun around, my pulse racing, but there was no one. The man hadn't moved. His gaze was fixed on me like he was waiting for me to make the first move. I didn't wait. I turned and ran. My feet slapped against the gravel as I sprinted back toward the car, panic rising in my chest with every breath. My heart was pounding in my ears, the sound of footsteps still following me, growing closer and closer. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear them, soft and steady, matching my pace. When I reached my car, I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. I could still hear the footsteps, but now they seemed to stop. I glanced frantically through the windows, scanning the empty road and the surrounding fields. There was nothing. No sign of anyone. The man, the footsteps, everything had disappeared. I took a shaky breath and tried to start the car. It turned over immediately, as though nothing had ever been wrong. I wasted no time, putting the car in gear and speeding away, my hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white. For the rest of the drive, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The silence of the countryside seemed to press in on me, heavy and suffocating. I drove faster, my eyes flicking constantly to the rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights behind me at any moment. But there was nothing. It wasn't until I reached the nearest town that I was able to calm down, but I still couldn't shake the memory of those footsteps, of the strange man standing by his truck. I never figured out who he was or what he wanted. I only knew that I was lucky to have escaped. I had just finished a late shift at work, and the rain had begun to pour down as I stepped out of the office building. The clock on my dashboard read 11:47 p.m., and I was exhausted. It had been a long day, and all I could think about was getting home and getting some rest. As I pulled onto the highway, the faint sound of raindrops hitting my windshield was the only noise that kept me company. The road was empty, the only light coming from my headlights slicing through the darkness ahead. I was alone, just me and the endless stretch of road. The highway I was on was the kind that barely saw traffic after dark. It was a lonely stretch of road surrounded by trees and fields, with only the occasional billboard or farmhouse to break the monotony. I wasn't too far from home, but the drive always felt longer in the dead of night, especially with the rain making everything seem more isolated. About 30 minutes into my drive, I noticed something strange in the rearview mirror. A set of headlights had appeared behind me, far enough to be out of the ordinary but not so close that it was alarming. I figured it was just another car heading in the same direction, but as the minutes passed, I realized the car wasn't getting any further away. If anything, it was staying exactly the same distance behind me no matter how fast I drove. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that maybe the driver was just going at the same speed. But deep down, I felt that little itch of unease crawling up my spine. I decided to speed up just to see if the car would eventually pull ahead. I pressed my foot down harder on the gas pedal, and the engine roared to life as my car sped up to 80 miles per hour. But when I glanced in the mirror, the car was still there, maintaining the same distance. It was almost as if the car was deliberately following me no matter what I did. My heart began to race as I kept driving, now feeling a knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe it was just a coincidence. But as I passed a few more turns and the car behind me remained in perfect sync, I began to feel like I was in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I decided to take an exit onto a side road, hoping that if I changed routes, the car would lose interest. But to my growing horror, when I looked in the rearview mirror again, the car was still there, following me. This was no coincidence. Someone was deliberately tailing me. I had to think quickly. My first instinct was to call the police, so I grabbed my phone, but the rain was coming down harder now and the road was slick with water. I could barely see through the windshield. I punched in 911 on my phone and held it up to my ear, but just as the call was about to connect, the signal dropped. I cursed under my breath and tried again, but the call wouldn't go through. My phone kept showing no signal. Panic started to take over. I was trapped on this dark, desolate road with no way to reach anyone. I glanced in the rearview mirror once more, and that's when I saw it. The car had gotten closer. The headlights were brighter now, glaring in my mirror like two cold, unblinking eyes. I could barely make out the shape of the car, but there was something deeply unsettling about it, something I couldn't explain. The driver's side seemed to be empty, but I couldn't be sure. The more I looked, the more I felt like there was something lurking in the shadows. I made a sharp turn onto another road, hoping that maybe this time I'd be able to shake off my follower. My heart was pounding in my chest as I raced down the narrow road, the rain slashing against my windshield in sheets. The headlights behind me stayed locked in on me, unwavering. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I pulled into a gas station, desperate to get some help. The station was dark, the lights flickering like a dying candle, but there was a small convenience store open, and I rushed inside, hoping to find someone. The attendant, an older man, looked up from his newspaper as I barged in, panting. I think I'm being followed," I stammered. "There's someone following me, and I don't know what to do." The man raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. I turned around to look out the door, my eyes scanning the parking lot. That's when I saw it, the car. It was parked at the far end of the lot, its headlights glaring toward the door, and the driver's side was facing me. I tried to steady my breathing as I watched, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The car just sat there, unmoving, like a predator waiting for its prey. I looked back at the attendant, but before I could say anything, the door to the store suddenly creaked open. A man stepped inside. His face was expressionless, his eyes cold, and there was a strange, almost menacing air about him. He didn't speak, but he walked straight toward me, his footsteps slow and deliberate. I took a step back, fear creeping up my spine. "What do you want?" I whispered, but the man didn't answer. Instead, he just stood there, staring at me like he was waiting for something. Then, without warning, he turned around and walked back out the door. I didn't wait to see where he went. I bolted for my car and sped off as quickly as I could, not caring if the rain made the road slick or dangerous. I had to get away from there. The next morning when I woke up, I tried to convince myself that it had all been some kind of bad dream, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. I couldn't forget the man's cold, lifeless stare or the strange feeling that I was being hunted. The police never found anything. The car was gone and the man was never identified. I never heard from him again, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. And every time I drive down that same highway, I still wonder if he's out there somewhere waiting for me to come back. My girlfriend Sarah and I were desperate for a break. After weeks of long hours and constant stress, we decided to escape the city and spend a weekend at a secluded cottage in the woods. We found a place online that seemed perfect. A cozy, rustic cabin far from the noise, surrounded by trees. It promised peace, quiet, and solitude, just what we needed. We arrived just as the sun was setting, the sky painted with shades of orange and purple. The air was cool and crisp, and the woods surrounding the cottage seemed unusually still, as if they were holding their breath. The cottage itself looked charming in the fading light, wooden beams, a stone chimney, ivy creeping up the sides, but there was something unsettling about it too. The place had an aged, worn feel, as if it had been abandoned for years. I brushed it off as my imagination running wild. After all, it was exactly what we wanted, right? That evening we made ourselves at home. We lit a fire in the fireplace, made dinner, and settled in with a bottle of wine. The atmosphere was calm, but there was an odd kind of silence in the air, the kind that felt heavy, almost oppressive. The sound of the wind, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds. Nothing. It was as if the world outside had gone completely quiet. I didn't mention it, but I could tell Sarah felt it too. She kept looking out the window, her gaze lingering on the dark woods as if she were expecting something, or someone, to emerge from the shadows. Around midnight, when we were about to go to bed, the silence was shattered by a creak coming from upstairs. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but then it came again, louder, clearer. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, like someone was walking around in the attic. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that old houses creak, but the more I listened, the more uneasy I felt. Sarah, who had been lying beside me, suddenly sat up in bed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her tone strained. I nodded, trying to stay calm. "It's probably just the house settling," I said, though my words felt hollow. The creaks continued, slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking across the wooden floor above us. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. Something, or someone, was up there. I tried to ignore it, but my mind kept racing. Eventually, I convinced myself that it was nothing. I told Sarah to try to sleep, but neither of us got any rest that night. The sounds upstairs continued, but neither of us had the courage to go up and investigate. What if it was someone? What if we weren't alone? The next morning, I decided to check out the upstairs. The cottage wasn't big, just 2 floors, and I figured it wouldn't hurt to look around. The stairs creaked under my weight as I made my way up. The hallway on the 2nd floor was narrow, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. The air felt heavier here, thick with dust and a musty smell that seemed to cling to everything. I reached the attic, the door slightly ajar. I hesitated before pushing it open. I half expected to find old furniture or boxes of forgotten belongings, but when I stepped inside, I found only dust and cobwebs. The attic was empty, save for one thing, an old photograph hanging crookedly on the far wall. It was framed with a cracked piece of glass. I took it down to have a better look. The photo was black and white, showing a man and a woman standing in front of the very cottage we were staying in. The woman looked familiar, almost identical to the cottage owner. I wondered for a moment if it was her, but it was the man beside her that made my skin crawl. His smile wasn't right. It wasn't natural. It seemed forced, like he was trying to smile but couldn't quite manage it. His eyes were wide, almost too wide, and there was something unsettling about the way he looked at the camera. I couldn't quite place it, but I had to look away. As I turned to leave, I heard it. a faint whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, but no, this was different. It came from behind me, soft but clear, as if someone had just spoken my name. Get out. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I spun around, but the attic was empty. The voice had come from nowhere. I quickly made my way back downstairs, my mind racing. It wasn't just the house settling. It wasn't just my imagination. There was something in this place, something that didn't want us there. When I returned to the living room, Sarah was sitting near the fire, staring out the window. I could tell something was wrong. There was a look of fear on her face, something I hadn't seen before. She didn't say anything at first, but her eyes kept flicking toward the trees outside, as if she was watching for something. I think someone's out there, she finally said, her voice trembling. I saw movement in the trees. I stood up, walking over to the window, but I didn't see anything. The forest was dark, and the rain had begun to fall, making everything look blurry. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right, that something was out there, watching us. We decided to leave. It wasn't worth the discomfort, the fear gnawing at the edges of our thoughts. But when we packed up to leave and headed out the door, Sarah pointed to the woods. Look, she said. Someone's watching us. I turned around, but the trees were empty, the shadows thick and impenetrable. Yet I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cottage, and for a moment I thought I saw someone in the window staring out at us. The figure was too vague to be certain, but the feeling of eyes on me, cold and distant, lingered long after we'd left. When we reached the nearest town, I called the owner of the cottage to let her know we were leaving early. Her voice was quiet when she answered, as if she had been waiting for my call. Did you find the photograph? She asked. I told her we had. She sighed deeply. That man in the photo, he was my husband. He disappeared years ago. People say he never really left the woods. We never went back. The photo, the whispers, the feeling of being watched, it was all too much. Something about that place felt wrong. I don't know what we encountered in that cottage, but I do know one thing. I have no intention of ever finding out. It was a long drive back from the mountains. I had spent the weekend camping with some friends, and now I was on my own, heading home after a few days of being out in the wilderness. The highway stretched for miles, with nothing but dense forest on either side. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the sky was darkening quickly. I had just crossed into a remote stretch of road that I knew all too well, one that had always given me an unsettling feeling. The winding highway, the isolation, it all seemed to amplify the silence. It was a stretch I typically avoided driving at night, but tonight I didn't have much of a choice. I was about an hour into the drive when I noticed a figure on the side of the road. It was a man standing just off the shoulder, his thumb outstretched in that familiar hitchhiker gesture. It was strange, considering how isolated this area was. There was no town for miles, and it was already late. I had passed a few other cars, but there weren't many. Still, something about the man didn't feel right. He stood motionless, just staring into the dark, waiting. I debated whether or not to stop. Normally, I would have kept going. Hitchhiking was dangerous, and the thought of picking up a stranger in the middle of nowhere made me uneasy. But there was something in his posture, something that tugged at me like he was in distress. The more I thought about it, the more I felt compelled to stop. Maybe he needed help. So I slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. The man approached the car slowly, his footsteps barely audible in the night. He was tall, thin, with unkempt dark hair and a long, weathered coat that seemed out of place for the time of year. His face was pale, and his eyes were unnervingly empty. There was something hollow about them, as if he hadn't slept or eaten in days. I rolled down my window just enough to speak to him, though I kept my distance. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to gauge his demeanor. "Just to the next town," he replied, his voice low and monotone. "Not far. Could you give me a ride?" I hesitated. Something in his voice didn't sit right with me. It was too flat, too detached, like he wasn't fully there. Still, I told myself I was overthinking it and unlocked the passenger door. He climbed in without saying another word, the scent of stale sweat and something else, something metallic, lingering in the air as he settled in beside me. We drove in silence for a few minutes, the hum of the tires on the road the only sound between us. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, but he was staring straight ahead, his face expressionless. It was like he wasn't even aware of me sitting beside him. I tried to make small talk, asking how long he had been out there, where he was from. But he only gave short, vague answers, barely acknowledging the questions. His attention remained fixed on the road ahead. It was unsettling, but I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just being paranoid. After all, he was a hitchhiker. He probably wasn't used to normal social interaction. As we drove on, the road became even more desolate. No streetlights, no other cars. Just the darkness and the occasional tree lining the sides of the highway. After what felt like an eternity, I noticed something strange in the rearview mirror. A set of headlights had appeared behind us, far off in the distance. At first, it seemed like another car, but as it got closer, I realized that it wasn't catching up as quickly as it should have. It was moving at a slow, almost deliberate pace, trailing us at a constant distance. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced at the hitchhiker. He hadn't moved an inch. His eyes were still fixed ahead, but I had the feeling that he was aware of something. He was waiting, like he knew something was coming. A chill crawled up my spine, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me. It was then that the car behind us flickered, its headlights going out for a brief moment before turning back on, only to flicker again. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my heart racing. I didn't know what was happening, but something wasn't right. The hitchhiker finally spoke, his voice disturbingly calm. "Don't stop," he said, his tone flat. "Whatever you do, don't stop the car." I looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" I asked, but he didn't answer. He just stared straight ahead, his face devoid of emotion. I didn't know what to do. I thought about speeding up, but that might just make the situation worse. I could barely see the car behind us now, its headlights flickering in and out of view, but I felt its presence like a shadow following us. Then the car behind us did something that made my stomach drop. It swerved violently across the road as if it were trying to overtake us. My heart skipped a beat as I slammed on the gas, but just as quickly as it had swerved, the car disappeared from my view, swallowed up by the darkness behind us. I didn't stop. I didn't dare. For the next few miles, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I kept my eyes on the road, my foot heavy on the accelerator. It felt like hours before I saw the lights of a small town in the distance, a tiny speck of civilization in the midst of the vast, empty highway. When I finally pulled into the first gas station I could find, I turned to tell the hitchhiker we were there, but he was gone. The seat beside me was empty. I sat there for a moment, stunned. I didn't know what had happened, but it felt like I had just been part of some strange dream. I got out of the car, my legs shaky as I approached the gas station attendant. "Did you see that guy?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "The hitchhiker I picked up?" The attendant stared at me, his face unreadable. "There was no one there," he said, his voice low. I turned to look at the empty road, the headlights of my car casting long shadows across the pavement. The man I had picked up was gone, as if he had never existed at all. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I'll never forget that night. I don't know if he was real or if he was something else. But every time I drive down that stretch of road, I wonder if I'll ever see him again. And if I do, whether I'll be able to keep driving or if I'll stop just like he wants me to. Alright, that's all the stories for today. I'm so glad you stayed with me until the end. It really means a lot. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you next time.